Hey guys, tonight we're venturing into the windswept moors and fog-draped coastlines of England, where one of the most enduring and genuinely unsettling legends has prowled for over 1,000 years. And honestly, you probably won't survive this encounter with your skepticism intact, because we're tracking the Black Shuck, a spectral hound whose glowing eyes have been burning holes through the darkness since before your ancestors even knew what a proper cup of tea was supposed to taste like. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. There's something beautifully connective about all of us sharing these dark tales across different time zones. Whether you're settling into midnight in Manchester or catching this during your lunch break in Tokyo. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the ancient soil of East Anglia, where the North Sea crashes against cliffs that have witnessed more than their fair share of supernatural encounters, and the very ground beneath your feet holds memories that stretch back through Romano-British settlements, through Saxon invasions, and even further into the misty realm of Celtic Britain, because this is where our story truly begins, not with medieval chroniclers or Tudor-era pamphleteers, but in the deep prehistoric consciousness of people who understood that the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds was far more porous than we modern folks might prefer to believe. The Celtic Britons who first walked these lands carried with them a rich tapestry of beliefs about otherworldly creatures, and among these supernatural beings, few held as much primal terror as the great hounds that were said to guard the boundaries between life and death, and you can almost feel the weight of those ancient fears as you breathe in the salt-tinged air that has carried whispers of spectral encounters for millennia. Archaeological evidence from sites like Grimes Graves in Norfolk, dating back over 4,000 years, reveals that these lands have been considered mystically significant since the Neolithic period, when our ancestors mined flint deep underground in what some scholars suggest were ritualistic practices connecting them to underworld deities. The Romans, practical as they were about most things, encountered these Celtic traditions when they conquered Britain in 43 CE. And rather surprisingly for a people who usually dismissed local superstitions as mere barbarian nonsense, they seem to have developed a healthy respect for the ghostly hounds that the natives described with such vivid terror. Though perhaps this respect came from the fact that Roman soldiers, supposedly the most disciplined in the world, kept reporting their own encounters with massive black dogs that appeared along their well-engineered roads at night. You might chuckle at the image of a Roman centurion filing an official report about a supernatural dog sighting. But the reality is that some of these accounts survive in fragmentary form, suggesting that even the empire's most rational administrators took these encounters seriously enough to document them. As centuries passed and Saxon settlers established their own kingdoms across what would become England, they brought with them their own canine supernatural traditions, including beliefs about hellhounds and supernatural wolves that served various gods and spirits. And the fascinating thing is how these Germanic traditions seem to blend seamlessly with the existing Celtic beliefs about spectral dogs, creating a rich hybrid mythology that would eventually coalesce into the legend we know as Black Shuck. The very name Shuck itself carries linguistic mysteries that scholars continue to debate, with some arguing it derives from the Anglo-Saxon skuka, meaning demon or devil, while others suggest connections to the Old English skioken, meaning to shake or terrify. Though honestly, both interpretations work perfectly well for a creature whose primary job description apparently involves making grown adults question their life choices while running screaming across dark moorland. One particularly intriguing fringe theory suggests that the name might be related to the Old Norse skugi, meaning shadow, which would connect the legend to Viking influences along England's eastern coast. And while this theory lacks solid etymological support, there's something poetically appropriate about a creature of shadows carrying a name that literally means shadow. The question of whether ancient Britons actually encountered some unknown species of large canid, whether they experienced shared cultural hallucinations, or whether the legend grew from more mundane encounters with actual wolves or large domestic dogs, remains hotly debated among folklorists and historians, with some scholars arguing that the consistency of descriptions across different regions and time periods suggests either a genuine cryptozoological phenomenon or at least encounters with something more substantial than pure imagination. You can imagine how these stories spread through communities where literacy was rare and oral tradition carried the weight of historical record, passed from generation to generation around winter fires, each telling, adding new details while preserving the essential terror that made the tale worth remembering in the first place. The early medieval period saw Christianity gradually replacing pagan beliefs throughout Britain, but rather than eliminating supernatural folklore, Christian doctrine often absorbed and reinterpreted these traditions, and Black Shuck became associated with demonic forces rather than Celtic otherworld guardians, though this theological shift didn't make the creature any less frightening to the average Anglo-Saxon farmer who might encounter glowing eyes in the darkness while walking between villages. Monasteries, those bastions of learning and Christian virtue, became unexpected repositories for supernatural lore, as monks who were supposed to be focused on higher spiritual matters found themselves recording local legends with surprising attention to detail, perhaps because even men of God recognized that understanding local beliefs was essential for effective ministry, or maybe because monks, despite their vows, were just as fascinated by scary stories as anyone else. The Domesday Book of 1086, that remarkable Norman census that attempted to catalogue everything of value in England, makes no direct mention of spectral hounds, but it does record numerous place names that reference wolves, devils, and supernatural creatures, suggesting that supernatural geography was so integral to local identity that even practical Norman administrators couldn't ignore it, though one can't help wondering what William the Conqueror would have made of officials reporting that certain parishes came with complimentary ghost dogs. By the time the first written accounts of Black Shuck encounters begin appearing in medieval chronicles, the legend had already been shaped by centuries of oral tradition, creating a creature that embodied the deepest fears of rural communities: the terror of traveling alone at night, the uncertainty of what lurked beyond the safety of hearth and home, and the ever-present possibility that the natural world concealed forces that could destroy human life without warning or mercy. You realize, as you stand here in this ancient landscape, that Black Shuck represents something more profound than a simple monster story. It's a cultural memory that has survived conquest, religious conversion, social upheaval, and technological revolution, adapting to each new era while maintaining its essential power to unsettle anyone who hears its howl echoing across the marshlands. And perhaps that persistence suggests something more than mere superstition, something rooted in experiences and fears, so fundamental to human nature that no amount of rational explanation can entirely dismiss them. You settle into the candlelit scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, where monks with ink-stained fingers and surprisingly vivid imaginations began transforming whispered folklore into written record, because by the 12th and 13th centuries, the oral tradition surrounding England's supernatural hound had grown so persistent and detailed that even scholarly clerics felt compelled to document encounters that challenged their theological worldview. And it's here, among illuminated manuscripts and carefully preserved parchments, that Black Shuck first emerges from the realm of campfire stories into the more permanent world of historical documentation. The medieval mind operated with a fascinating blend of rational scholarship and supernatural acceptance that seems almost impossible to modern sensibilities, where the same monks who painstakingly copied classical texts on mathematics and natural philosophy would, without apparent contradiction, record detailed accounts of demonic dogs appearing in parish churches or stalking travelers along well-traveled roads, and you can almost picture these learned men debating whether such encounters represented divine punishment, demonic manifestation, or perhaps some previously unknown aspect of God's creation. Ralph of Coggeshall's Chronicle from the early 13th century, one of the most reliable sources for medieval English history, includes what many scholars consider the first detailed written account of a black shuck encounter, describing how a great black dog of supernatural size appeared to a group of travelers near Bungay in Suffolk. And what makes this account particularly compelling is Ralph's typically measured prose, which treats the supernatural encounter with the same matter-of-fact tone he uses to describe political events or natural phenomena. The chronicles reveal that medieval witnesses described the creature with remarkably consistent details. A dog larger than any natural hound, coal-black fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, eyes that glowed with an inner fire described variously as red, green, or yellow depending on the account, and a presence that filled observers with an overwhelming sense of dread that went far beyond normal fear of wild animals, though you might wonder if medieval people simply had lower expectations for their daily dose of existential terror than we do. One particularly intriguing aspect of these early written accounts is how they reflect the tension between Christian theology and persistent pagan beliefs, with chroniclers often struggling to fit supernatural encounters into acceptable religious frameworks, sometimes describing Black Shuck as a demon sent to punish the wicked, other times as a mysterious creature that might serve divine purposes beyond human understanding, and occasionally as something that existed in a theological gray area that made church authorities distinctly uncomfortable. The Peterborough Chronicle, compiled at the famous Abbey, mentions several incidents involving Dolflundiu Flandes, devil's hounds, that terrorized the surrounding countryside during the anarchic period of Stephen's reign in the 12th century. And while historians debate whether these references describe genuine supernatural encounters or metaphorical representations of political chaos, the fact remains that medieval scribes felt these accounts worthy of inclusion alongside battles, royal deaths, and other significant historical events. Medieval bestiaries, those wonderfully bizarre encyclopedias of real and imaginary creatures, began including entries for supernatural hounds during this period, often accompanied by elaborate illustrations that show creatures bearing striking resemblance to later Black Shuck descriptions. And while these bestiary entries were typically moralistic in nature, designed to teach Christian lessons rather than provide zoological information, they demonstrate how thoroughly the legend had penetrated learned culture by the High Middle Ages. The phenomenon of church grim legends, found throughout medieval Europe but particularly strong in England, may have influenced or been influenced by Black Shuck traditions, as many communities believed that spectral dogs guarded sacred grounds, protecting churches and graveyards from malevolent spirits, though the relationship between protective church grims and the more sinister Black Shuck remains one of those delightfully murky areas where folklore refuses to follow tidy academic categories. You might find it amusing that some of the most detailed medieval accounts of Black Shuck encounters come from tax records and legal documents, where practical-minded officials recorded witness testimony about supernatural incidents that allegedly prevented the collection of tolls or completion of official business, suggesting that even in the medieval period, people weren't above using ghost stories to avoid their civic responsibilities, though whether these claims were genuine or creative excuses remains charmingly unclear. The writings of Gervase of Tilbury, a 13th century chronicler who specialized in collecting supernatural accounts from across Europe, include several references to English spectral hounds that match Black Shuck descriptions, and Gervase's systematic approach to documenting supernatural phenomena provides valuable insight into how medieval scholars attempted to understand and categorize encounters with the inexplicable. Medieval medical texts occasionally reference the psychological and physical effects of encounters with supernatural creatures, describing symptoms that modern researchers recognize as consistent with severe psychological trauma, including persistent nightmares, loss of appetite, and what medieval physicians termed melancholia, conditions that seem remarkably similar to what we might now diagnose as post-traumatic stress disorder following a genuinely terrifying experience. The question of whether medieval chroniclers embellished folklore accounts to serve literary or theological purposes continues to generate scholarly debate, with some historians arguing that dramatic supernatural elements were added to make moral points about sin and redemption, while others maintain that the consistency of details across multiple independent sources suggests these accounts preserve genuine eyewitness testimony, however we might interpret the nature of what was actually witnessed. Court records from the 13th and 14th centuries include several cases where individuals claimed supernatural encounters as legal defenses for various infractions, including a fascinating case from Norfolk, where a merchant successfully argued that his failure to deliver goods on schedule resulted from being stalked by a black demon hound that prevented him from traveling at night. And while modern legal systems might view such defenses with skepticism, medieval courts apparently took these claims seriously enough to record them in official proceedings. The medieval understanding of time and space differed significantly from modern concepts, and chroniclers often described supernatural encounters as occurring at liminal moments, dawn, dusk, midnight, or at boundary locations such as crossroads, bridges, or the edges of settlements, suggesting that medieval people understood Black Shuck as a creature that existed primarily in the spaces between normal reality and other world, which may explain why the legend has proven so resistant to rational explanation. Monastic libraries preserved not only formal chronicles but also marginal notes, personal accounts, and informal records that reveal how deeply Black Shuck legends had penetrated medieval consciousness, with references appearing in everything from sermon notes to account books, suggesting that encounters with the supernatural hound were considered sufficiently commonplace to merit casual mention alongside routine daily events. You find yourself appreciating the medieval chronicler's approach to supernatural phenomena, which combined careful attention to detail with an acceptance that the world contained mysteries beyond human understanding, and their writings create a bridge between the ancient oral traditions that gave birth to the Black Shuck legend and the more systematic documentation that would characterize later periods. When scholars would attempt to apply increasingly sophisticated analytical methods to phenomena that might simply refuse to submit to rational explanation, leaving us with a rich written tradition that preserves both the terror and wonder that this legendary creature has inspired for nearly a millennium, you step into the salt-weathered fishing villages that dot England's eastern coast, where generations of fishermen, smugglers, and coastal dwellers have passed down Black Shuck stories with the same reverence they reserve for tide tables and weather lore. Because in these communities where survival depends on understanding the sea's moods and the land's hidden dangers, supernatural knowledge carries practical weight, and the legend of the spectral hound becomes not merely entertainment but essential information for anyone brave enough to venture out after dark. These coastal settlements, with their narrow lanes that twist between stone cottages and their harbors that have sheltered boats since Saxon times, created the perfect environment for supernatural folklore to flourish, where isolation bred imagination, harsh living conditions made death a constant companion, and the endless rhythm of waves against cliffs provided a natural soundtrack for ghostly encounters. The fishing community of Aldeburgh in Suffolk, immortalized centuries later in Benjamin Britten's opera Peter Grimes, developed one of the most elaborate Black Shuck traditions, with local fishermen reporting encounters that stretched back through family memories to times when their ancestors first cast nets into the North Sea, and the consistency of these accounts across generations suggests either a remarkable dedication to preserving fictional details or genuine encounters with something that defies conventional explanation. Aldeburgh's version of the Black Shuck legend includes unique maritime elements that distinguish it from inland accounts, with witnesses describing the creature appearing on the beach during storms, its glowing eyes visible through sheets of rain and spray, sometimes walking on the water itself or emerging from waves like some unholy fusion of ghost dog and sea monster, though you might wonder if generations of fishermen's rum rations contributed to the more spectacular aspects of these sightings. The Tudor period brought significant changes to England's coastal communities, including increased maritime trade, more sophisticated shipbuilding, and unfortunately more opportunities for supernatural encounters, as detailed records from Harwich show customs officials documenting incidents where Black Shuck allegedly interfered with cargo inspections, And while modern readers might suspect these reports served as convenient excuses for smuggling activities, the bureaucratic language used to describe supernatural encounters suggests officials took these claims seriously enough to file them alongside routine shipping records. Coastal folklore often connected black shuck sightings to specific weather patterns, with many communities reporting that the creature appeared most frequently during the liminal periods around storm systems, when atmospheric pressure changes and electromagnetic disturbances might create conditions that, according to some fringe theories, could trigger perceptual anomalies or even manifest genuine paranormal phenomena. Though mainstream meteorology remains skeptical of any connection between barometric pressure and ghostly dog sightings, despite the statistical correlation that some amateur researchers claim to have documented. The village of Cromer, famous for its crabs and Victorian seaside charm, preserves one of the most intriguing black shuck accounts in the form of a 16th century church record, describing how the creature allegedly saved a fisherman from drowning by barking to alert rescuers, which represents a fascinating departure from the typically malevolent characterization of the spectral hound, and suggests that coastal communities developed more nuanced relationships with their supernatural guardian than the simple fear that dominated inland accounts. You can almost taste the salt air and hear the creak of fishing boats as you imagine how these stories spread through waterfront taverns, where sailors from different ports would compare their supernatural encounters over pints of ale, gradually creating a shared mythology that transcended individual village boundaries, while maintaining distinctive local variations that reflected each community's unique relationship with both the sea and the mysterious forces that seem to inhabit the boundary between water and land. The phenomenon of sea dogs, unusual wave formations that create dog-like shapes in rough water, provides one rational explanation for some maritime black shuck sightings, though this geological explanation fails to account for the consistent reports of glowing eyes, supernatural behavior, and the profound psychological effects that witnesses describe experiencing during their encounters. Smuggling operations, which flourished along England's eastern coast from medieval times through the 19th century, added another layer to black shuck folklore, with some smugglers apparently encouraging supernatural fears to discourage interference from customs officials or curious locals, while others genuinely reported encountering the spectral hound during their nighttime activities, creating a complex interplay between deliberate myth-making and authentic supernatural experiences that historians are still attempting to untangle. The question of whether coastal black shuck legends influenced or were influenced by similar traditions from continental Europe remains actively debated among folklorists, with some scholars arguing that maritime trade routes facilitated the exchange of supernatural beliefs between English fishing communities and their counterparts in the Netherlands, Denmark, and northern France, where comparable spectral hound legends exist with suspiciously similar characteristics. Women in these coastal communities often served as the primary keepers of black shuck lore, passing stories from grandmother to granddaughter, along with practical knowledge about herbal remedies, weather signs, and other survival skills that the male-dominated fishing economy undervalued, and their versions of the legend frequently included protective rituals and warning signs that could help travelers avoid dangerous encounters, practical supernatural knowledge that proved its worth through generations of successful application. The evolution of coastal black shuck stories reflects broader changes in maritime life, with earlier accounts focusing on encounters along ancient trackways and coastal paths, while later versions incorporate references to lighthouses, improved roads, and modern shipping, demonstrating the legend's remarkable adaptability to changing technological and social conditions while maintaining its essential character and emotional impact. Some of the most compelling modern black shuck accounts come from these same coastal communities, where contemporary fishermen, Coast Guard personnel, and residents continue reporting encounters that mirror historical descriptions with uncanny accuracy, suggesting either remarkable cultural continuity in maintaining fictional traditions or ongoing encounters with phenomena that transcend normal explanation, though you might note that modern witnesses seem just as reluctant as their historical predecessors to submit to detailed questioning about their experiences. The archaeological record along England's eastern coast reveals evidence of ritual activity dating back to prehistoric times, including votive offerings and burial sites that suggest ancient recognition of supernatural forces associated with the boundary between land and sea. And some researchers theorize that Black Shuck legends may preserve folk memories of actual religious practices involving sacred animals or totemic spirits that guarded these liminal spaces. Coastal communities developed sophisticated methods for distinguishing between different types of supernatural encounters, with experienced locals claiming ability to differentiate between genuine Black Shuck sightings, other types of ghostly phenomena, and natural occurrences that might be mistaken for supernatural activity, creating an informal but surprisingly detailed taxonomy of paranormal experience that reflects generations of careful observation and transmitted wisdom. The social function of Black Shuck stories in coastal villages extends beyond entertainment or supernatural belief, to serve as coded warnings about real dangers, rough terrain, hazardous weather, criminal activity, or dangerous individuals, with the spectral hound serving as a culturally acceptable way to communicate safety information that might otherwise be difficult to discuss directly, particularly in communities where social harmony depends on avoiding direct confrontation or explicit accusations. You find yourself recognizing that these coastal Black Shuck traditions represent something more sophisticated than simple ghost stories, functioning as complex cultural mechanisms that preserve historical memory, encode practical survival information, maintain social cohesion, and provide psychological frameworks for processing encounters with the unknown, all while maintaining their power to send chills down your spine when you hear them whispered over the sound of waves crashing against ancient stones in the gathering darkness of an English evening. You emerge into the tumultuous world of Tudor England, where Henry VIII's break with Rome created not only religious upheaval, but also a supernatural crisis that left the entire kingdom questioning which spiritual forces could be trusted. And in this atmosphere of theological uncertainty, legends like Black Shuck took on new significance as people struggled to understand whether such creatures represented Catholic demons, Protestant devils, or perhaps something altogether outside the Christian cosmology that both faiths claimed to encompass completely. The dissolution of the monasteries, beginning in 1536, inadvertently scattered centuries of carefully preserved supernatural lore as monastic libraries were dispersed, burned, or sold to private collectors who may not have fully appreciated that they were acquiring some of England's most detailed records of paranormal encounters, including numerous Black Shuck accounts that had been meticulously maintained by generations of scholarly monks who apparently found ghostly dog sightings worthy of the same careful attention they devoted to copying classical texts. Tudor-era printing technology revolutionized the spread of supernatural folklore, with broadsides and pamphlets carrying Black Shuck stories to audiences far beyond the East Anglian regions where encounters were most commonly reported. And these printed accounts often embellished traditional folklore with dramatic details designed to capture readers' attention, not coincidentally, to serve the political and religious agendas of whatever faction happened to be controlling the printing presses at any given moment. The reign of Mary I, known to Protestant propaganda as Bloody Mary, saw Black Shuck legends appropriated by both Catholic and Protestant writers, with Catholic authors arguing that the spectral hound punished heretics while Protestant pamphleteers claimed the creature targeted those who remained loyal to Rome, creating a theological tug-of-war that must have left the poor supernatural dog wondering exactly whose side it was supposed to be on, though apparently it continued making appearances regardless of the religious affiliation of witnesses. Elizabeth Warst's court, despite its reputation for Renaissance learning and rational governance, included numerous individuals who took supernatural phenomena seriously, including the Queen herself, who consulted astrologers and maintained court positions for learned men who studied everything from alchemy to angel summoning, suggesting that even the most sophisticated Tudor minds saw no contradiction between intellectual advancement and belief in phenomena like spectral hounds. The Elizabethan era's flowering of literature brought Black Shuck into the realm of popular entertainment, with playwrights and poets incorporating elements of the legend into works that reached audiences ranging from London's educated elite to rural communities, where traveling players performed in inn-yards. And while these artistic adaptations often transformed the terrifying supernatural hound into a more manageable literary device, they also ensured that the legend would survive even if genuine sightings eventually ceased. Maritime expansion during the Tudor period brought English sailors into contact with supernatural traditions from around the world, and ship logs from this era occasionally record encounters with ghostly dogs in exotic locations, leading some modern researchers to speculate whether these represent cultural export of English folklore, independent development of similar legends, or genuine encounters with phenomena that transcend geographical boundaries, though skeptics note that sailors have always been particularly creative when it comes to supernatural storytelling. The question of whether Tudor-era social upheaval contributed to increased Black Shuck sightings, or whether improved literacy simply meant more encounters were recorded, continues to puzzle historians who study the intersection of social conditions and paranormal reports, with some scholars arguing that periods of political instability create psychological conditions conducive to supernatural experiences, while others maintain that the appearance of increased activity merely reflects better documentation rather than actual increases in encounters. Tudor legal records preserve fascinating evidence of how supernatural beliefs intersected with practical jurisprudence, including cases where Black Shuck encounters were cited as evidence in trials ranging from property disputes to accusations of witchcraft, and these legal documents reveal that educated judges trained in both common law and classical learning were surprisingly willing to consider supernatural testimony as potentially relevant to legal proceedings. The Protestant Reformation's emphasis on personal spiritual experience rather than institutional religious authority may have inadvertently validated individual reports of supernatural encounters, including Black Shuck sightings, as people who had been taught to trust their own spiritual perceptions became more confident in reporting experiences that might previously have been dismissed by ecclesiastical authorities as delusions or demonic temptations. Regional variations in Black Shuck legends became more pronounced during the Tudor period, as improved transportation and communication networks allowed different communities to compare their supernatural traditions while maintaining distinctive local characteristics, creating a rich tapestry of related but distinct folklore that reflected the complex political and cultural geography of Tudor England, though you might wonder if travelers of the time appreciated having to memorize different supernatural protocols for each region they visited. The rise of Protestant scholarship brought new analytical approaches to supernatural phenomena, with learned divines attempting to categorize ghostly encounters according to biblical precedent and theological doctrine, and their treatises on supernatural subjects reveal sophisticated attempts to understand creatures like Black Shuck within systematic religious frameworks that somehow manage to be both intellectually rigorous and completely divorced from anything resembling empirical evidence. Elizabeth Forst's government, always sensitive to threats against royal authority, occasionally investigated reports of supernatural phenomena that might indicate political unrest or foreign interference, and intelligence records from the period suggest that government agents seriously considered whether Black Shuck sightings might be connected to Catholic plots, Spanish espionage, or other threats to national security, proving that paranoia and supernatural belief could combine in remarkably creative ways. The medical understanding of supernatural encounters advanced significantly during the Tudor period, with physicians trained in both classical learning and contemporary European scholarship beginning to document the physical and psychological effects of Black Shuck encounters, and their case studies reveal symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as consistent with severe trauma, though Tudor doctors typically attributed these effects to spiritual rather than psychological causes. Tudor-era witch trials, while less extensive than their continental European counterparts, occasionally featured testimony involving Black Shuck or similar supernatural creatures, and trial records reveal the complex ways in which folkloric beliefs, legal procedures, and community tensions intersected around accusations of supernatural activity, creating legal precedents that would influence English jurisprudence's approach to supernatural claims for centuries to come. The economic prosperity of Elizabethan England supported a flourishing market for supernatural entertainment, including plays, ballads, and printed stories featuring creatures like Black Shuck. And this commercialization of folklore helped preserve traditional stories while also transforming them into commodities that could be bought, sold, and adapted to meet consumer demand, though the original spectral hound presumably received no royalties from these commercial ventures. Agricultural innovations during the Tudor period, including improved plowing techniques and land drainage projects, brought human activity into previously wild areas where Black Shuck encounters had traditionally occurred, and some historians speculate that this expansion of human settlement may have contributed to changes in the legend, as the supernatural hound adapted to new landscapes while maintaining its essential characteristics as a boundary-crossing creature that challenged the security of human civilization. The Tudor understanding of natural philosophy, influenced by classical texts rediscovered during the Renaissance, encouraged systematic observation and record-keeping that inadvertently created better documentation for supernatural phenomena. And scholars of the period approached Black Shuck encounters with the same methodical attention they devoted to botanical studies or astronomical observations, producing detailed accounts that continue to fascinate modern researchers regardless of their conclusions about the ultimate reality of what was being documented. You realize that Tudor England's complex relationship with Black Shuck reflects broader cultural tensions about tradition and innovation, local identity and national unity, spiritual authority and individual experience, creating a rich historical context that helps explain why the legend not only survived the religious and social upheavals of the 16th century, but actually emerged stronger and more widely known than ever before, ready to face whatever challenges the coming centuries might bring to England's most persistently mysterious supernatural inhabitant. You step through the heavy wooden doors of St. Mary's Church in Bungay, Suffolk, on what should have been a peaceful Sunday morning in August 1577. But instead you find yourself witnessing what would become the most famous and thoroughly documented Black Shuck encounter in recorded history, an event so dramatic and well attested that it transcended folklore to become a cornerstone of supernatural scholarship that scholars continue debating with the same intensity usually reserved for major historical battles or royal succession disputes. The morning of August 4th, 1577, began unremarkably enough in this prosperous market town, where parishioners gathered for morning service just as they had every Sunday for generations, unaware that they were about to experience an encounter that would transform their quiet Suffolk community into the epicenter of England's most enduring supernatural mystery. And you can almost feel the oppressive humidity that contemporary accounts describe settling over the town like a suffocating blanket that seemed to muffle sound and make every breath an effort. The Reverend Abraham Fleming, whose detailed account of the morning's events would ensure his place in supernatural history, later wrote that the storm that broke over Bungay that Sunday possessed an unusual quality that made experienced farmers and sailors exchange worried glances, with lightning that seemed to strike with deliberate precision rather than random fury and thunder that rolled across the landscape with what witnesses described as an almost musical quality, as if the storm itself were performing some cosmic symphony that human ears weren't quite equipped to properly appreciate. As the congregation settled into their pews for what they expected to be a routine service, the storm outside intensified beyond anything in local memory, with winds that stripped thatch from roofs, and rain that fell with such force that it seemed to be attacking the earth rather than merely watering it. And inside the church, candles flickered despite the absence of drafts, while the ancient stones seemed to vibrate with each thunderclap, creating an atmosphere of supernatural tension that made even the most rational parishioners begin to question whether this was entirely natural weather. The moment that would define Bungay's place in supernatural history occurred sometime between the reading of the Gospel and the beginning of the sermon, when what Fleming described as a strange and terrible wonder manifested in the form of a massive black dog that appeared suddenly in the midst of the congregation, not entering through any door or window, but simply materializing as if the darkness between lightning flashes had taken solid form and decided to attend Sunday service. Contemporary accounts describe the creature as larger than any natural dog, with fur so black it seemed to absorb light from the church's candles and windows, eyes that glowed with an inner fire that witnesses variously described as red, green, or yellow, depending on their vantage point, and a presence that filled the sacred space with such overwhelming terror that strong men wept and women fainted before the creature had taken a single step, though you might wonder if the combination of supernatural fear and oppressive heat simply proved too much for Tudor-era fashion choices that weren't designed for either comfort or crisis management. The Black Shuck's behavior inside the church followed a pattern that would become central to the legend, as the creature moved through the congregation with what witnesses described as deliberate purpose, seemingly ignoring most parishioners while focusing its attention on specific individuals. And Fleming's account records that the supernatural hound passed between the pews, as Weyerfurt sought some certain personne, creating a scene of controlled terror where most of the congregation remained frozen in their seats while the creature conducted its mysterious business. The physical evidence left by the Black Shuck's visit to Bungay Church became one of the most compelling aspects of the entire account, as the creature allegedly killed 2 parishioners, a man and a boy who were kneeling in prayer, simply by passing near them, with no apparent physical contact, but leaving their bodies as black as a coal, according to Fleming's graphic description, while a third man suffered severe burns to his hands and face that would mark him for the rest of his life as a survivor of supernatural encounter. The architectural damage attributed to the Black Shuck's presence included scorch marks on the church door, and what appeared to be claw marks gouged into the stone. And remarkably, some researchers claim that evidence of this supernatural vandalism remains visible today, though the question of whether these marks represent genuine paranormal phenomena or centuries of wishful thinking by tourists and ghost hunters continues to generate heated debate among historians, archaeologists, and supernatural investigators. Fleming's account, published as A Strange and Terrible Wonder within months of the event, represents one of the earliest attempts to apply systematic documentation techniques to supernatural phenomena, with the Reverend including witness names, specific details about the creature's appearance and behavior, and careful attention to the sequence of events that transforms his pamphlet from sensational entertainment into something approaching scholarly investigation, though his theological interpretation of the events as divine punishment for communal sins reflects 16th century religious thinking rather than modern paranormal research methods. The social impact of the Bungay encounter extended far beyond the immediate congregation, as word of the supernatural visitation spread throughout East Anglia and eventually reached London, where court officials took sufficient interest to dispatch investigators who interviewed witnesses and examined the physical evidence, and their reports, preserved in state archives, provide valuable corroboration for Fleming's account, while adding additional details that suggest the official investigation was conducted with considerable thoroughness. The question of whether the Bungay Black Shuck represented a genuine supernatural manifestation, mass hysteria triggered by severe weather conditions, or some combination of natural phenomena and psychological factors remains actively debated among researchers who continue analyzing the historical evidence with increasingly sophisticated methodological approaches, though the consistency and specificity of witness accounts continue to challenge purely naturalistic explanations. The timing of the Bungay encounter, occurring during a period of religious tension and social change in Elizabethan England, has led some scholars to interpret the event as a manifestation of collective anxiety about theological uncertainty and cultural transformation, while others argue that reducing such well-documented phenomena to psychological or sociological explanations fails to account for the physical evidence and multiple independent witness testimony that characterizes this particular case. The medical aspects of the Bungay encounter include detailed descriptions of the symptoms experienced by survivors, including persistent nightmares, loss of appetite, and what Fleming termed melancholy, that affected witnesses for months after the event. And these psychological effects bear striking resemblance to what modern psychiatry would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, resulting from exposure to genuinely terrifying experiences. St. Mary's Church became a pilgrimage destination for supernatural enthusiasts and scholarly investigators alike, with visitors from across England and Europe making journeys to Bungay to examine the alleged physical evidence and interview descendants of witnesses, creating a tourist industry around supernatural investigation that predated by centuries the modern fascination with paranormal tourism and ghost hunting expeditions. The legal implications of the Bungay encounter included questions about whether supernatural events could be considered acts of God for insurance purposes, whether witness testimony about paranormal phenomena could be admitted in court proceedings, and whether the church bore any liability for supernatural injuries sustained on consecrated ground. Legal questions that revealed the practical challenges of integrating supernatural belief with institutional governance. The architectural investigation of St. Mary's Church, by modern researchers using advanced photographic and chemical analysis techniques, has produced intriguing but inconclusive results regarding the alleged supernatural damage, with some experts arguing that certain marks show characteristics inconsistent with normal weathering or human-caused damage, while skeptics maintain that centuries of restoration work and tourist handling have made definitive analysis impossible. Fleming's theological interpretation of the Black Shuck encounter as divine punishment for moral failings reflects broader Protestant emphasis on direct divine intervention in human affairs. But his detailed description of the creature's behavior suggests genuine fascination with the phenomenon beyond its potential spiritual significance, revealing the complex relationship between religious doctrine and empirical observation that characterized learned Tudor approaches to supernatural investigation. The cultural legacy of the Bungay Black Shuck encounter extends far beyond supernatural folklore to influence literature, art, and popular entertainment, with the specific details of Fleming's account appearing in works by authors ranging from Victorian ghost story writers to contemporary paranormal investigators, ensuring that this particular manifestation of England's most famous spectral hound continues to captivate imaginations more than 4 centuries after that terrifying August morning, when the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds seemed to dissolve entirely within the sacred walls of a Suffolk parish church. You travel the 7 miles from Bungay to the Holy Trinity Church in Blithburgh, following the same route that the Black Shuck allegedly took on that infamous August day in 1577. And as you approach this magnificent medieval church with its soaring timber roof and weathered stone walls, you realize you're about to encounter the second half of what many consider the most extraordinary supernatural event in recorded English history, an encounter that occurred within hours of the Bungay incident and provides such remarkable corroborating evidence that even the most determined skeptics find themselves struggling to explain away the consistency and specificity of witness accounts that span multiple communities and independent observers. The Church of the Holy Trinity in Blithburgh stands as one of Suffolk's most impressive medieval buildings, earning the nickname Cathedral of the Marshes for its imposing scale and architectural grandeur. But on that storm-lashed August afternoon in 1577, its sacred beauty became the backdrop for supernatural terror that would transform this peaceful riverside community into the second epicenter of England's most famous paranormal encounter. And the evidence of that visitation allegedly remains embedded in the church's ancient stonework to this day. Contemporary accounts describe how the Black Shuck arrived in Blithburgh sometime in the early afternoon, apparently having covered the distance from Bungay with supernatural speed that defied both geography and natural law, and witnesses reported seeing the massive creature approaching the church along the old Roman road with a purposeful gait that suggested specific intent rather than random wandering, as if the spectral hound were following some predetermined schedule that required visits to multiple sacred sites within a single day. The storm that had battered Bungay continued its assault on Blithburgh with even greater ferocity, if such intensity were possible. creating atmospheric conditions that witnesses described as apocalyptic in their violence, with lightning strikes that seemed to target the church spire repeatedly, and their violence. With lightning strikes that seemed to target the church spire repeatedly, winds that howled through the marshlands, with what several observers characterized as voices crying out in languages that no living person could understand, though you might suspect that the combination of extreme weather and supernatural anticipation could make anyone hear otherworldly voices in perfectly natural wind patterns. The congregation gathered in Holy Trinity that afternoon represented a cross-section of Blythburgh society, including prosperous merchants, local farmers, church officials, and visiting travelers who had sought shelter from the storm, and this diverse group of witnesses would later provide remarkably consistent accounts of what transpired when the Black Shuck entered their sanctuary, lending additional credibility to an event that might otherwise be dismissed as mass hysteria affecting a single homogeneous community with shared cultural expectations. The creature's entrance into Blythburgh Church differed significantly from its manifestation at Bungay, as multiple witnesses described seeing the Black Shuck burst through the church's heavy wooden doors with such force that the impact was heard throughout the building, and unlike the mysterious materialization reported at Bungay, the Blythburgh encounter began with unmistakably physical interaction between the supernatural creature and its material environment. The most famous and enduring evidence of the Blythburgh encounter consists of the alleged claw marks that the Black Shuck left on the church door, scorch marks on stone pillars, and impressions in the floor that visitors can still observe today, though the question of whether these marks represent genuine supernatural phenomena or centuries of enthusiastic interpretation by believers continues to generate spirited debate among historians, archaeologists, and paranormal investigators who apply increasingly sophisticated analytical techniques to medieval stonework. The behavior exhibited by the Black Shuck during its Blythburgh visitation followed patterns similar to those reported at Bungay, with the creature moving through the church with apparent purpose, focusing its attention on specific individuals while ignoring others, and leaving behind physical evidence of its presence that would be examined and debated for centuries to come. But the Blythburgh account includes additional details that suggest the supernatural hound possessed intelligence and intentionality that went far beyond simple animal behavior, even supernatural animal behavior. Local tradition maintains that the Black Shuck's claw marks on the Blythburgh church door were made as the creature departed, scratching at the wood with such force that it gouged deep grooves that remain visible today. And while skeptics point out that centuries of weathering, repair work, and tourist handling could easily account for wear patterns on medieval woodwork, believers note that the marks show characteristics that seem inconsistent with normal deterioration or human-caused damage. The human casualties at Blythburgh followed the same mysterious pattern observed at Bungay, with witnesses reporting that individuals who came too close to the Black Shuck suffered severe burns or simply collapsed and died without any apparent physical contact from the creature, and the medical aspects of these alleged supernatural injuries continue to puzzle researchers who struggle to identify natural phenomena that could produce the specific symptoms described in contemporary accounts. The Reverend Bundle, Blythburgh's parish priest, provided detailed testimony about the encounter that complements and corroborates Fleming's Bungay account, and Bundle's report includes technical observations about the creature's physical characteristics, behavior patterns, and environmental effects that demonstrate remarkable consistency with the independent Bungay testimony, lending additional credibility to both accounts while raising profound questions about the nature of the phenomena being documented. The architectural investigation of Holy Trinity Church has revealed anomalies in the stone and woodwork that some researchers argue support supernatural explanations, while others maintain that normal processes of construction, weathering, and repair over more than 4 centuries could easily account for any unusual characteristics observed in the building's fabric, creating an ongoing scholarly debate that reflects broader questions about the relationship between physical evidence and paranormal claims. The social impact of the Blythburgh encounter extended throughout the broader community, with local records indicating that church attendance dropped significantly in the weeks following the Black Shuck visitation. Businesses reported decreased activity as people avoided traveling after dark, and regional markets experienced disruptions as merchants became reluctant to transport goods along roads where supernatural creatures had been sighted, demonstrating the practical economic consequences of supernatural belief, regardless of the ultimate reality of what was believed. The question of why the Black Shuck chose to visit both Bungay and Blythburgh on the same day has generated numerous theories among researchers, ranging from suggestions that the creature was following ancient ley lines or prehistoric pathways, to hypotheses that the two churches possessed some shared spiritual significance that attracted supernatural attention, to more prosaic explanations that the same atmospheric conditions responsible for the severe weather might have triggered similar psychological phenomena in both communities. The preservation of physical evidence at Blythburgh has made it a focal point for modern paranormal investigation, with researchers using everything from traditional photography to sophisticated electromagnetic detection equipment in attempts to gather empirical data about the alleged supernatural phenomena, though the results of such investigations tend to reveal more about the investigators' preconceptions than about the historical events they're attempting to study. The cultural memory of the Blythburgh encounter has remained remarkably vivid within the local community, with families preserving oral traditions about the event across more than 20 generations, and these folk memories include details that don't appear in written records, suggesting either remarkable cultural continuity in preserving historical information or ongoing creativity in embellishing ancient stories, though distinguishing between preservation and invention becomes increasingly difficult across such extended time periods. The legal documentation surrounding the Blythburgh encounter includes witness depositions, property damage assessments, and insurance claims that provide valuable insights into how 16th century institutions attempted to process supernatural events within existing administrative frameworks, revealing both the practical challenges and creative solutions that emerged when bureaucracy confronted phenomena that existed outside normal regulatory categories. The comparative analysis of the Bungay and Blythburgh accounts reveals striking parallels in witness testimony, creature behavior, and physical effects that either indicate remarkable consistency in mass hallucination or genuine encounters with phenomena that operated according to consistent principles, and this comparative evidence continues to serve as a cornerstone for arguments both supporting and challenging supernatural explanations for these historical events. The modern tourism industry that has developed around the Black Shuck legend focuses heavily on both Bungay and Blythburgh as the two most significant sites associated with the supernatural hound, creating an economic incentive for preserving and promoting the historical accounts, while also raising questions about how commercial interests might influence contemporary interpretation of medieval evidence. The theological implications of supernatural visitations to consecrated ground troubled 16th century religious authorities, who struggled to reconcile the apparent violation of sacred space with their understanding of divine protection and ecclesiastical sanctity, and their theological treatises on the Blythburgh encounter reveal sophisticated attempts to maintain religious doctrine while acknowledging empirical evidence that challenge traditional spiritual categories. You find yourself standing in Holy Trinity Church, surrounded by centuries of history, and the lingering questions that the Black Shuck encounter has bequeathed to subsequent generations, and whether you interpret the alleged claw marks as evidence of supernatural visitation or remarkable persistence in folk belief, you cannot escape the recognition that something extraordinary occurred here on that August afternoon in 1577, something powerful enough to capture imaginations and challenge assumptions across more than 4 centuries of cultural change and intellectual development. You settle into the hushed atmosphere of academic libraries and conference halls where contemporary scholars engage in spirited debates about Black Shuck's ultimate origins, armed with archaeological evidence, linguistic analysis, comparative mythology, and theoretical frameworks that would have utterly baffled the medieval monks who first documented encounters with England's supernatural hound. Yet somehow these modern intellectual tools seem no more capable of definitively resolving the mystery than the theological approaches that preceded them by 8 centuries. The question of whether Black Shuck traditions derive primarily from pre-Roman Celtic mythology, post-conquest Germanic folklore, or some complex hybrid of indigenous and imported supernatural beliefs, continues to generate passionate scholarly disagreement that occasionally threatens to overshadow the civility normally expected at academic gatherings. And you might find it amusing that creatures which terrified medieval peasants now inspire equally intense emotions among professors who probably haven't experienced genuine mortal terror since their dissertation defenses. Dr. 1. Jennifer Westwood, whose seminal work Albion, A Guide to Legendary Britain, helped establish modern folkloric scholarship's approach to supernatural legends, argues that Black Shuck represents a survival of ancient Celtic beliefs about otherworld guardians that were adapted and preserved through successive cultural transformations, while her critics maintain that such continuity theories underestimate the creative capacity of medieval communities to generate entirely new mythological traditions without requiring prehistoric foundations. The linguistic evidence surrounding the name Shuck itself reveals the complexity of determining cultural origins, as etymological analysis suggests possible derivations from Anglo-Saxon skuka, demon, Old English skiokan, to terrify, or even Old Norse skugi, shadow. And while each proposed etymology supports different theories about the legend's cultural origins, the reality is that place names and supernatural terminology often evolve through processes so complex that definitive conclusions remain tantalizingly out of reach, though this uncertainty doesn't prevent scholars from defending their preferred interpretations with remarkable tenacity. The comparative mythology approach to Black Shuck studies has revealed striking parallels with spectral hound legends throughout Europe, including the Barghest of northern England, the Cwsych of Scotland, the Gwilgi of Wales, and the Dip of Catalonia. And while these similarities might suggest either shared ancient origins or universal psychological foundations for such beliefs, the specific cultural adaptations that characterize each tradition demonstrate remarkable diversity within apparent uniformity, creating a scholarly puzzle that requires balancing recognition of common patterns with appreciation for unique local developments. Archaeological evidence from prehistoric Britain includes numerous sites where dog remains have been found in ritual contexts, suggesting that canines held special spiritual significance for ancient inhabitants. But the question of whether these archaeological discoveries indicate religious practices that could have evolved into Black Shuck legends, or simply reflect the practical importance of dogs in ancient societies, remains hotly debated among researchers who can make compelling arguments for both supernatural and secular interpretations of the same material evidence. The psychogeographical approach to Black Shuck studies, popularized by researchers like John Michel, and later developed by contemporary scholars, examines the relationship between supernatural encounters and specific landscape features, revealing patterns that suggest certain geographical locations may be more conducive to paranormal experiences, though whether these patterns reflect actual environmental factors that influence perception or simply cultural traditions that associate particular places with supernatural activity continues to divide academic opinion. Dr. Bohm. Thuchtors Forewis Low. Mark Norman's recent statistical analysis of Black Shuck sightings reveals intriguing correlations with geological features, electromagnetic anomalies, and meteorological patterns that some researchers argue support theories about environmental factors contributing to supernatural experiences, while skeptics maintain that apparent correlations between natural phenomena and paranormal reports more likely reflect selective attention and confirmation bias among investigators who want to find patterns in random data. The question of whether ancient British religious practices included actual sacred dogs that might have inspired later supernatural legends receives support from classical sources, including Caesar's accounts of Celtic religious customs and Tacitus's descriptions of Germanic tribal practices. But these historical references are sufficiently vague and culturally biased that modern scholars can interpret them to support virtually any theory about prehistoric spiritual traditions they prefer to advance. Feminist archaeological theory has contributed new perspectives to Black Shuck studies by examining how supernatural folklore might preserve memories of pre-patriarchal spiritual traditions where female-associated animals and otherworld guardians played central roles in community religious life, though these interpretations remain controversial among scholars who question whether sufficient evidence exists to support such specific reconstructions of ancient gender relationships and religious practices. The neurological approach to understanding supernatural encounters has gained prominence through researchers like Dr. Michael Persinger, whose studies of electromagnetic field effects on brain function suggest that certain environmental conditions might trigger perceptual experiences that could be interpreted as paranormal encounters. And while this research offers intriguing possibilities for understanding Black Shuck sightings, critics note that laboratory-induced hallucinations typically lack the consistency, specificity, and cultural coherence that characterize traditional supernatural encounters. The digital humanities revolution has enabled unprecedented analysis of historical Black Shuck accounts through database technologies that allow researchers to identify patterns across thousands of documents spanning centuries of records, and preliminary results from these computational approaches reveal previously unrecognized geographical clusters, temporal patterns, and linguistic evolution that both support and challenge existing theories about the legend's development and cultural significance. Medieval studies. Scholars continue debating whether Black Shuck legends reflect actual wildlife encounters with wolves or large feral dogs that survived in England longer than conventional histories suggest. And while the official extinction of wolves in England occurred during the Tudor period, some researchers argue that isolated populations might have persisted in remote areas long enough to contribute to supernatural folklore, though distinguishing between encounters with actual animals and genuinely paranormal phenomena remains methodologically challenging. The anthropological approach to Black Shuck studies emphasizes the social functions that supernatural beliefs serve within communities, including their roles in transmitting safety information, maintaining social cohesion, and providing psychological frameworks for processing traumatic experiences. And while these functional analyses help explain why such legends persist across generations, they don't necessarily resolve questions about the ultimate reality of the phenomena that inspire supernatural beliefs. Postmodern folklore theory has challenged traditional approaches to Black Shuck studies by questioning whether attempting to determine historical origins or empirical reality represents the most productive scholarly approach, arguing instead that understanding how supernatural beliefs function within cultural systems and individual psychology might provide more valuable insights than trying to establish whether spectral hounds actually exist, though this theoretical sophistication sometimes seems to obscure, rather than illuminate, the genuinely mysterious aspects of the phenomena being studied. The collaborative international research project initiated by the University of East Anglia's Centre for East Anglian Studies has attempted to coordinate investigation of Black Shuck legends across multiple academic disciplines, including history, archaeology, psychology, environmental science, and literary studies. And while this interdisciplinary approach has generated valuable new insights, it has also revealed the extent to which different methodological frameworks can analyze the same evidence and reach completely contradictory conclusions. The question of whether contemporary Black Shuck sightings represent continuations of ancient phenomena, modern recreations of historical legends, or entirely new manifestations inspired by cultural memory, continues to challenge researchers who must navigate the complex relationship between historical documentation, contemporary experience, and academic objectivity, while investigating claims that exist at the intersection of empirical inquiry and supernatural belief. The publishing industry's appetite for supernatural content has created both opportunities and challenges for serious Black Shuck scholarship, as academic researchers find themselves competing for public attention with popular authors who prioritize entertainment value over methodological rigor. Yet this broader cultural interest has also increased funding opportunities and public support for scholarly investigation of phenomena that might otherwise be dismissed as unworthy of serious academic consideration. Emerging technologies, including satellite archaeology, ground-penetrating radar, and advanced chemical analysis, continue revealing new information about historical sites associated with Black Shuck encounters. And while these technological capabilities offer unprecedented opportunities for gathering empirical data about supernatural claims, they also demonstrate how much we still don't understand about the relationship between physical evidence and paranormal experiences. You find yourself appreciating that contemporary scholarly debates about Black Shuck origins reflect broader questions about the relationship between empirical evidence and cultural belief, the persistence of supernatural traditions in rational societies, and the ongoing human need to understand phenomena that challenge conventional frameworks for interpreting reality, and regardless of which theoretical approaches ultimately prove most productive, the scholarly engagement with these questions reveals as much about modern intellectual culture as it does about medieval supernatural encounters, suggesting that every generation must find its own ways of grappling with mysteries that refuse to submit to definitive explanation, regardless of how sophisticated our analytical tools become. You step into the gaslit world of Victorian England, where scientific rationalism and spiritual curiosity created the perfect conditions for systematic supernatural investigation, as societies dedicated to psychical research applied newfangled empirical methods to ancient mysteries like Black Shuck, armed with photography, telegraph networks, and an unshakable confidence that any phenomenon, no matter how mysterious, could eventually yield its secrets to properly organized scientific inquiry, though their results proved rather more ambiguous than the optimistic researchers had initially anticipated. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882 by Cambridge scholars who refused to dismiss supernatural claims without proper investigation, launched the first systematic study of English spectral hound legends as part of their broader effort to document and analyze paranormal phenomena using the same methodological approaches that had proven successful in physics, chemistry, and biology. And while their conclusions remained diplomatically non-committal, their meticulous documentation created an invaluable archive of witness testimony and historical research that continues to inform contemporary Black Shuck studies. Eleanor Sidgwick, one of the Society's most rigorous investigators, spent considerable time in East Anglia during the 1890s collecting Black Shuck accounts from elderly residents who claimed to preserve family memories of supernatural encounters, and her careful interviews revealed remarkable consistency in traditional descriptions, while also documenting how the legend had evolved and adapted to changing social conditions, including the increasing frequency of sightings near railway lines and telegraph poles, technological innovations that apparently didn't discourage supernatural creatures from maintaining their traditional haunting schedules. The Victorian fascination with photography as a tool for capturing empirical evidence of supernatural phenomena led to numerous attempts to photograph Black Shuck, resulting in a collection of blurry, ambiguous images that believers interpreted as conclusive proof, while skeptics dismissed as photographic artifacts, double exposures, or outright fraud. And while none of these early photographs withstand modern technical scrutiny, they represent fascinating attempts to bridge the gap between subjective experience and objective documentation that characterized Victorian approaches to paranormal investigation. Dr. William Barrett, a physics professor who helped establish the Society for Psychical Research, developed sophisticated experimental protocols for investigating supernatural encounters that included detailed witness interviews, environmental measurements, and attempts to recreate conditions under which paranormal phenomena allegedly occurred. And while his Black Shuck investigations failed to produce the repeatable results that scientific methodology requires, Barrett's approach influenced generations of paranormal researchers who continue attempting to apply laboratory standards to phenomena that seem fundamentally resistant to controlled observation. The Ghost Club, founded in London in 1862, and claiming membership including Charles Dickens and Arthur Conan Doyle, organized several expeditions to investigate Black Shuck sightings. combining Victorian adventure tourism with serious paranormal research and expeditions that resembled scientific field trips equipped with camping gear, measuring instruments, and enough scientific enthusiasm to power a small steam engine, though their published reports suggest that supernatural phenomena proved remarkably uncooperative when confronted with organized investigation teams armed with notebooks and imperial determination. Victorian technological innovations, including improved transportation networks, allowed paranormal investigators to respond more quickly to reported supernatural encounters, and telegraph systems enabled coordinated research efforts that could correlate sightings across different geographical locations, creating unprecedented opportunities for systematic data collection that revealed previously unrecognized patterns in Black Shuck activities, while also demonstrating how modern communication could amplify and distort supernatural folklore in ways that medieval communities never experienced. The development of newspapers and popular magazines during the Victorian period created new venues for reporting supernatural encounters, and Black Shuck sightings began appearing regularly in publications ranging from respectable county newspapers to sensationalist periodicals that competed for readers' attention with increasingly dramatic accounts of paranormal activities, creating a feedback loop where media coverage influenced public expectations about supernatural encounters, while genuine experiences became increasingly difficult to distinguish from entertainment-oriented fiction. The Victorian medical establishment's growing understanding of psychology and neurology provided new frameworks for analyzing supernatural experiences, with physicians like Dr. Henry Maudsley arguing that Black Shuck encounters represented manifestations of collective hysteria, or individual mental disturbance, rather than genuine paranormal phenomena. Though these medical explanations struggled to account for the consistency, specificity, and historical continuity that characterized the most compelling supernatural reports. The emergence of anthropological studies during the Victorian period brought scholarly attention to the cultural functions of supernatural beliefs, with researchers like E.B. Tyler and James Fraser analyzing Black Shuck legends as examples of primitive survivals that persisted within modern civilization, and while their evolutionary approaches to cultural development seem dated by contemporary standards, their systematic documentation of folklore provided valuable resources for understanding how supernatural traditions adapt to changing social conditions while maintaining essential characteristics across generations. Victorian spiritualism's popularity created both opportunities and challenges for serious paranormal researchers, as public fascination with supernatural phenomena increased support for psychical research, while also attracting charlatans and enthusiasts whose unscientific approaches threatened the credibility of legitimate investigation, and Black Shuck studies became entangled with broader debates about the relationship between scientific methodology and spiritual experience that continue influencing contemporary approaches to paranormal research. The question of whether Victorian investigators' failure to produce definitive evidence of Black Shuck's existence reflected limitations in their methodology, the inherently elusive nature of supernatural phenomena, or the simple fact that they were attempting to document folklore rather than reality, remains actively debated among contemporary researchers who must grapple with similar methodological challenges using more sophisticated but not necessarily more effective technological tools. The social Darwinist thinking that influenced Victorian intellectual culture led some researchers to interpret Black Shuck legends as evolutionary remnants that would naturally disappear as human societies became more rational and scientifically sophisticated. But the persistence of supernatural encounters throughout the Victorian period and beyond demonstrated that technological progress and educational advancement did not automatically eliminate paranormal experiences or reduce public interest in supernatural phenomena. The Victorian railway network's expansion through previously isolated regions of East Anglia brought increased human traffic to areas where Black Shuck encounters had traditionally occurred, and some investigators theorized that railway construction might disturb supernatural phenomena by altering the geographical and electromagnetic conditions that allegedly influenced paranormal activities. though whether increased industrialization actually reduced supernatural encounters or simply changed their character remains unclear from the available evidence. The development of professional journalism during the Victorian period created new standards for documenting and reporting supernatural claims, with experienced reporters applying investigative techniques to paranormal stories and producing accounts that balanced skeptical inquiry with respect for witness testimony. And these journalistic investigations of Black Shuck sightings provide valuable historical sources that combine contemporary documentation with analytical frameworks that attempted to distinguish between credible reports and obvious fabrications. The Victorian amateur scientist tradition encouraged educated individuals to pursue independent research into subjects that professional institutions might ignore, and several dedicated investigators spent decades documenting Black Shuck encounters, collecting historical records, and attempting to identify environmental or psychological factors that might explain supernatural experiences, creating private archives that preserved valuable information while also demonstrating the limitations of individual research efforts lacking institutional support and peer review. The emergence of psychological research during the late Victorian period introduced concepts like suggestion, hallucination, and collective behavior that provided new explanatory models for supernatural experiences, and researchers began investigating whether Black Shuck encounters might result from psychological contagion, where hearing about paranormal phenomena influenced individuals to interpret normal experiences as supernatural, creating cycles of reinforced belief that could sustain folklore traditions independently of actual paranormal events. The Victorian era's fascination with ancient history and archaeology led investigators to search for connections between Black Shuck legends and prehistoric British religious practices, examining stone circles, burial mounds, and other archaeological sites for evidence that might illuminate the origins of spectral hound traditions. And while these investigations produced intriguing correlations between supernatural folklore and ancient sacred sites, definitive causal relationships between archaeological evidence and contemporary legends remained tantalizingly elusive. The international correspondence networks that Victorian scholars maintained enabled comparative studies of supernatural folklore from different cultures, revealing that spectral hound legends appeared in many societies worldwide, and these comparative investigations raised questions about whether Black Shuck represented a uniquely English phenomenon or a local variation of more universal human tendencies to interpret certain experiences in supernatural terms. Though distinguishing between independent cultural development and cross-cultural influence proved methodologically challenging, the scientific instrumentation available to Victorian paranormal investigators, while primitive by contemporary standards, represented significant advances over previous approaches to documenting supernatural phenomena, and researchers used everything from barometers and thermometers to early electrical detection equipment in attempts to identify environmental correlates of paranormal activity, creating precedents for technological approaches to supernatural investigation that continue influencing contemporary paranormal research despite their limited success in producing conclusive evidence. You find yourself recognizing that Victorian ghost hunters, despite their confident optimism about scientific progress and rational methodology, confronted the same fundamental challenges that continue frustrating contemporary paranormal researchers: the difficulty of applying empirical methods to phenomena that may not follow natural laws, the problem of distinguishing between genuine supernatural experiences and culturally influenced interpretation of ambiguous events, and the ongoing tension between skeptical inquiry and respectful consideration of witness testimony that reflects deeper questions about the relationship between scientific knowledge and human experience that transcend any particular historical period or methodological approach. You enter the ink-stained studies and smoky clubs where Victorian and Edwardian literary giants transformed Black Shuck from regional folklore into international popular culture. As writers ranging from Arthur Conan Doyle to M.R. James discovered that England's supernatural hound provided perfect raw material for stories that could terrify sophisticated readers while simultaneously exploring deeper themes about rationality, tradition, and the persistence of mystery in an increasingly scientific world. And their literary adaptations ensured that Black Shuck would transcend its East Anglian origins to become a fixture of English supernatural literature that continues inspiring contemporary writers who probably never heard of the original Suffolk legends. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles, published in 1902, represents perhaps the most famous literary adaptation of Black Shuck traditions, though Doyle transplanted the legend from East Anglia to Dartmoor, and created a rational explanation that ultimately reduces the supernatural hound to an elaborate criminal scheme involving phosphorescent paint and a particularly large mastiff, a resolution that satisfied readers' desire for logical closure while simultaneously demonstrating how literary treatment could both preserve and domesticate folkloric terror that had genuinely frightened people for centuries. The fascinating irony of Doyle's approach lies in how the creator of Sherlock Holmes, literature's most famous advocate for rational deduction, spent his later years passionately promoting spiritualism and supernatural beliefs, suggesting that even minds dedicated to logical analysis could find themselves drawn to phenomena that resisted empirical explanation, and his personal letters revealed genuine fascination with paranormal encounters that contrasts sharply with the debunking methodology he employed in his fictional detective stories. James, whose ghost stories set the standard for English supernatural literature, drew inspiration from East Anglian folklore for several of his tales, including elements that clearly reference Black Shuck traditions, and James's scholarly background as a medievalist at King's College, Cambridge, enabled him to incorporate authentic historical details into fictional narratives that felt convincingly rooted in genuine antiquarian research, creating stories that blur the boundaries between folkloric authenticity and literary invention in ways that continue influencing how readers understand the relationship between historical legends and contemporary supernatural literature. The question of whether James's academic credentials as a legitimate medieval scholar lend additional credibility to his fictional treatments of supernatural themes remains debated among literary critics who must navigate the complex relationship between scholarly authority and creative imagination, though James himself maintained that his ghost stories were intended purely as entertainment rather than documentation of genuine paranormal phenomena, a disclaimer that didn't prevent readers from interpreting his works as evidence for the historical reality of supernatural encounters. Algernon Blackwood's extensive supernatural fiction includes several stories that feature spectral hounds, clearly inspired by Black Shuck legends, and Blackwood's background as a practical outdoorsman who had spent time in remote wilderness areas lent authenticity to his descriptions of supernatural encounters in natural settings, creating literary works that combined folkloric elements with personal experience of landscapes where such encounters might plausibly occur. And his influence on subsequent supernatural literature ensured that Black Shuck-inspired creatures would become standard fixtures in English horror fiction. The development of popular magazines during the late Victorian and Edwardian periods created unprecedented opportunities for supernatural fiction to reach wide audiences, and publications like the Strand magazine and Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine regularly featured ghost stories that drew inspiration from traditional folklore, including numerous tales that incorporated elements from Black Shuck legends, creating a feedback loop where literary treatments influenced public understanding of folkloric traditions, while traditional beliefs provided raw material for commercial entertainment that reached audiences far beyond the geographical regions where the original legends developed. The emergence of children's literature as a distinct publishing category during this period led to sanitized adaptations of Black Shuck legends that transformed the terrifying supernatural hound into more manageable fictional creatures suitable for young readers, and while these adaptations removed the genuine terror that characterized traditional encounters, they also ensured that Black Shuck-inspired elements would become familiar to generations of readers who might later encounter more authentic versions of the legend with greater appreciation for their cultural significance. Rudyard Kipling's interest in English folklore and supernatural traditions led him to incorporate elements inspired by Black Shuck legends into several of his stories, including The Wish House and other tales that explore how ancient beliefs persist within modern communities. And Kipling's sophisticated understanding of how folkloric traditions function within social groups enabled him to create literary works that captured both the entertainment value and cultural significance of supernatural beliefs without reducing them to simple superstition or mere entertainment. The literary treatment of Black Shuck during this period reflected broader cultural tensions about the relationship between traditional beliefs and modern rationality, with some authors using supernatural folklore to critique excessive faith in scientific progress, while others employed folkloric elements to demonstrate the persistence of irrational thinking that educated individuals should presumably outgrow. And these different approaches to supernatural material reveal underlying disagreements about whether ancient traditions represent valuable cultural wisdom or unfortunate survivals from less enlightened historical periods. The influence of German Romantic literature on English supernatural fiction introduced psychological elements that transformed how writers approached folkloric material, with authors increasingly interested in exploring the mental states of characters who encounter supernatural phenomena rather than simply describing external manifestations of paranormal activity. And this psychological approach to supernatural literature created new possibilities for incorporating Black Shuck legends into stories that examine the complex relationship between perception, belief, and reality. The theatrical adaptations of supernatural literature during this period brought Black Shuck-inspired elements to live audiences who experienced folkloric terror through dramatic performance. And while Victorian stage technology couldn't create the sophisticated special effects that contemporary audiences might expect, the communal experience of theatrical supernatural entertainment created shared cultural references that influenced how people understood and discussed paranormal phenomena in their daily lives. The emergence of literary criticism as a professional discipline enabled more sophisticated analysis of how authors used folkloric material in their creative works, and critics began examining the techniques through which writers transformed traditional beliefs into literary entertainment, revealing the complex creative processes through which oral traditions became written literature and eventually influenced popular culture on national and international scales. The copyright laws that developed during this period created new economic incentives for authors to create original supernatural fiction rather than simply retelling traditional folklore, and this legal framework encouraged literary innovation while also creating potential conflicts between writers who wanted to use folkloric material and communities that considered such traditions part of their cultural heritage. Though such conflicts rarely arose in practice, since most folkloric traditions lacked the organized advocacy groups that might have challenged commercial appropriation of cultural material. The international circulation of English literature during the Victorian and Edwardian periods carried Black Shuck-inspired supernatural fiction to readers throughout the British Empire and beyond, creating global familiarity with English folkloric traditions that might otherwise have remained geographically limited. And this literary export of supernatural material contributed to the international influence of English culture, while also creating potential confusion between authentic folkloric traditions and their literary adaptations. The academic study of English literature that emerged during this period began treating supernatural fiction as a legitimate subject for scholarly analysis, and university professors started examining how authors used folkloric material in their creative works, creating analytical frameworks that influenced both literary criticism and folkloric studies. Though the academic legitimization of supernatural literature also risked reducing genuinely mysterious cultural traditions to mere literary devices suitable for classroom discussion and scholarly publication. The development of lending libraries and cheaper printing technologies during this period made supernatural literature accessible to broader audiences than ever before, and working-class readers gained access to literary treatments of folkloric traditions that their grandparents might have encountered only through oral transmission, creating new relationships between social class, literacy, and cultural tradition that complicated traditional patterns of how folkloric knowledge was preserved and transmitted across generations. The literary societies and reading clubs that flourished during this period created venues for discussing supernatural literature and its relationship to traditional beliefs, and these organized discussions influenced how educated individuals understood the cultural significance of folkloric traditions while also creating social pressures that could either validate or dismiss supernatural beliefs, depending on the intellectual fashions that happened to dominate particular social groups. The emergence of literary prizes and professional recognition for creative writing during this period encouraged authors to develop increasingly sophisticated approaches to supernatural material, and the commercial success of well-crafted ghost stories demonstrated that folkloric traditions could provide valuable raw material for serious literary work, rather than merely serving as sources for sensationalist entertainment designed to appeal to unsophisticated audiences seeking simple thrills. You realize that the literary transformation of Black Shuck legends during the Victorian and Edwardian periods represents a crucial moment in the evolution of supernatural folklore, when oral traditions that had developed within specific geographical and cultural contexts became raw material for commercial entertainment that reached international audiences, creating new relationships between authentic folkloric traditions and their literary adaptations that continue influencing how contemporary readers understand the relationship between historical beliefs and fictional entertainment, while also ensuring that Black Shuck would survive as a cultural reference point long after the social conditions that originally sustained the legend had disappeared from the communities where it first developed. You open the dusty archives and faded journals that preserve first-hand accounts of Black Shuck encounters, spanning from Tudor times to the present day, discovering that despite centuries of social change, technological advancement, and cultural evolution, the essential characteristics of witness testimony remain remarkably consistent, as if the supernatural hound has maintained its essential nature while adapting its manifestation methods to accommodate changing times. Though whether this consistency reflects cultural preservation of folkloric traditions or genuine encounters with phenomena that transcend historical change continues to puzzle researchers who struggle to distinguish between authentic experience and culturally influenced interpretation. The earliest documented eyewitness account comes from John Day, a Suffolk merchant whose detailed 1577 diary entry describes encountering a great black dog of most unnatural size while traveling between Ipswich and Beccles, and Day's description includes specific details about the creature's glowing eyes, silent movement, and the overwhelming sense of dread that accompanied its presence, written in prose that suggests genuine terror rather than literary embellishment. Though modern readers must consider how 16th-century linguistic conventions and cultural expectations might have shaped even the most sincere attempts at factual documentation, Margaret Whitlock's 1643 testimony, preserved in Puritan church records from Bungay, describes how she encountered Black Shuck while walking to evening prayer service, and her account includes unique details about the creature's behavior that don't appear in other sources, including its apparent ability to move without creating footprints, and its tendency to maintain a specific distance from observers, as if following rules of engagement that governed supernatural encounters in ways that witnesses could observe but not fully understand. The Diary of Captain Thomas Fowler, an 18th-century naval officer stationed in Great Yarmouth, includes multiple Black Shuck sightings that occurred during his shore leaves between 1756 and 1763, and Fowler's maritime background lends credibility to his careful observations of the creature's apparent imperviousness to weather conditions and its ability to appear and disappear without regard for physical obstacles like walls, buildings, or natural barriers that would constrain normal animals. The industrialization of East Anglia during the 19th century created new contexts for Black Shuck encounters, as railway workers, factory employees, and urban residents began reporting sightings in industrial settings that differed significantly from the rural environments where traditional encounters had occurred. Yet the essential characteristics of witness testimony remained consistent, despite these dramatically changed social and physical environments. suggesting either remarkable adaptability on the part of supernatural phenomena or persistent cultural frameworks that influenced how people interpreted unusual experiences. Sarah Meynell's 1887 account, documented by investigators from the Society for Psychical Research, provides one of the most detailed Victorian-era descriptions of a black shuck encounter, including her observation that the creature seemed to be searching for something specific rather than simply wandering randomly, and her description of attempting to photograph the entity with her box camera, an early example of technological approaches to documenting supernatural phenomena, though the resulting image showed only an indistinct dark blur that could represent either paranormal evidence or photographic malfunction. The correspondence of Dr. James Morrison, a country physician practicing in Norfolk during the 1920s, includes references to several patients who sought medical treatment for symptoms they attributed to black shuck encounters, including persistent nightmares, unexplained anxiety, and physical symptoms that Morrison couldn't diagnose using conventional medical knowledge, and his clinical notes revealed genuine puzzlement about conditions that seemed to have psychological origins but manifested physical effects that didn't conform to recognized psychiatric or neurological patterns. The Mass Observation Project that documented British social conditions during World War II included interviews with elderly East Anglian residents who claimed to have witnessed black shuck encounters, and these testimonies, collected by trained social scientists using standardized interview protocols, provide valuable evidence about how supernatural folklore was understood and transmitted within working-class communities that maintained strong oral traditions despite increasing urbanization and social change. The question of whether wartime conditions influenced supernatural experiences emerged from several documented cases during the 1940s, as blackout restrictions, increased nocturnal activity, and heightened psychological stress created environmental conditions that some researchers argue might have been conducive to paranormal encounters, though determining whether war-related factors actually increased supernatural activity or simply made people more likely to interpret unusual experiences in supernatural terms remains methodologically challenging. The 1950s brought new technological possibilities for documenting supernatural encounters, as affordable cameras, tape recorders, and other consumer electronics enabled witnesses to attempt empirical documentation of their experiences, though the resulting evidence typically proved ambiguous and subject to multiple interpretations that satisfied neither believers nor skeptics, demonstrating the persistent challenges of applying technological solutions to phenomena that might exist outside normal physical laws. The counterculture movements of the 1960s created renewed interest in supernatural phenomena among educated young people who might previously have dismissed folkloric traditions as superstitious nonsense, and several well-documented black shuck encounters from this period involve university students, artists, and other individuals whose cultural backgrounds would seem to preclude belief in supernatural creatures, yet whose detailed testimony suggests genuine encounters with phenomena that challenge their rationalist worldviews. The establishment of paranormal research organizations during the 1970s enabled more systematic documentation of contemporary black shuck sightings, with investigators using improved recording equipment, standardized interview protocols, and coordinated research methods that produced archives of witness testimony, characterized by unprecedented detail and analytical sophistication, though the results of these investigations continued to generate more questions than answers about the ultimate nature of the phenomena being documented. The proliferation of mass media during the late 20th century created new challenges for evaluating eyewitness testimony, as potential witnesses increasingly encountered fictional representations of supernatural hounds through television, films, and popular literature before experiencing their own encounters, raising questions about whether contemporary sightings represent genuine paranormal experiences or unconscious recreation of culturally familiar imagery, though distinguishing between authentic experience and media-influenced interpretation remains difficult, even for experienced investigators. The digital age has revolutionized documentation of supernatural encounters through online platforms that enable witnesses to share their experiences immediately with global audiences. And several recent Black Shuck accounts include photographic or video evidence captured using smartphone technology, though digital manipulation capabilities also create new possibilities for fabrication that complicate efforts to evaluate the authenticity of contemporary eyewitness testimony and physical evidence. The geographic distribution of reported Black Shuck encounters has expanded significantly beyond traditional East Anglian boundaries during recent decades, with sightings reported from throughout Britain and even internationally, raising questions about whether supernatural phenomena can relocate or whether cultural diffusion of folkloric traditions has enabled people in previously unaffected areas to interpret their experiences using Black Shuck imagery rather than local supernatural frameworks. The demographic analysis of Black Shuck witnesses reveals intriguing patterns that transcend simple cultural or educational categories, with encounters reported by individuals ranging from agricultural workers and truck drivers to university professors and medical professionals, suggesting that whatever psychological, environmental, or supernatural factors contribute to such experiences, they don't discriminate based on social class, educational attainment, or professional background in ways that might be expected if cultural belief systems were the primary determining factors. The medical documentation of physical and psychological effects experienced by Black Shuck witnesses has improved significantly with advances in psychiatric and neurological understanding, and contemporary case studies reveal symptom patterns that sometimes persist for years after alleged supernatural encounters, including specific phobias, sleep disturbances, and anxiety reactions that seem disproportionate to normal animal encounters, but consistent with exposure to genuinely traumatic experiences. The legal implications of eyewitness testimony about supernatural encounters have evolved considerably as courts have developed more sophisticated understanding of human perception, memory, and psychological factors that influence testimony, and while contemporary legal systems remain skeptical of paranormal claims, the consistency and specificity of Black Shuck witness accounts continue to pose interesting questions about the relationship between subjective experience, objective reality, and institutional recognition of phenomena that exist outside normal evidentiary categories. The comparative analysis of historical and contemporary Black Shuck testimony reveals both remarkable continuities and significant changes in how witnesses describe their encounters, with consistent elements including the creature's size, color, luminous eyes, and psychological effects, while variable factors include details about the supernatural hound's interaction with modern technology, transportation systems, and urban environments that didn't exist during earlier historical periods. The international research collaborations that have developed around Black Shuck studies enable unprecedented comparative analysis of witness testimony from different cultural contexts, and preliminary results suggest that while specific folkloric traditions vary significantly across different societies, the underlying psychological and phenomenological patterns associated with supernatural hound encounters show surprising consistency that transcends cultural boundaries and suggests either universal human tendencies or genuine encounters with phenomena that manifest similarly across different geographical and cultural contexts. You find yourself confronting the accumulated weight of 4 centuries' worth of eyewitness testimony that resists easy dismissal while simultaneously challenging conventional frameworks for understanding reality, and whether these accounts represent cultural preservation of ancient beliefs, psychological manifestations of archetypal fears, or genuine encounters with supernatural phenomena. Their persistence and consistency across such extended historical periods suggest that Black Shuck occupies a unique position in human experience that transcends simple categories of belief and disbelief to engage fundamental questions about the nature of perception, reality, and the limits of rational explanation. You step into the analytical realm, where modern psychology attempts to dissect the Black Shuck phenomenon using theoretical frameworks that range from Freudian psychoanalysis to contemporary neuroscience, discovering that each new psychological theory seems to illuminate certain aspects of supernatural encounters, while simultaneously revealing how much mystery remains embedded within human consciousness, and you might find it ironic that disciplines dedicated to understanding the mind often struggle more with unexplained phenomena than the medieval scholars who simply accepted that reality contained aspects beyond human comprehension. The emergence of psychology as a scientific discipline during the late 19th century provided new vocabularies for discussing supernatural experiences, with researchers like William James exploring how individual consciousness might generate encounters that feel genuinely external while actually originating within psychological processes, and James's concept of varieties of religious experience offered frameworks for understanding Black Shuck sightings as manifestations of spiritual or psychological states rather than encounters with external supernatural entities. Though this interpretive approach raised complex questions about the relationship between internal experience and external reality that continue challenging contemporary researchers, Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory suggested that supernatural encounters like Black Shuck sightings might represent projections of unconscious psychological conflicts, with the spectral hound potentially symbolizing repressed fears, guilt, or traumatic memories that manifest in externalized form when psychological defense mechanisms become overwhelmed. And while Freudian interpretations of folkloric phenomena often seem reductive by contemporary standards, they introduced important concepts about how unconscious mental processes might influence perception and memory in ways that could generate experiences indistinguishable from external encounters. Carl Jung's analytical psychology offered alternative frameworks for understanding supernatural phenomena through concepts like the collective unconscious and archetypal imagery, suggesting that Black Shuck encounters might represent manifestations of universal psychological patterns that transcend individual experience to connect with deeper layers of human consciousness. And Jung's personal interest in paranormal phenomena led him to argue that dismissing supernatural experiences as mere hallucinations or delusions might ignore important aspects of psychological reality that conventional psychiatric categories couldn't adequately address. The development of behaviorist psychology during the early 20th century shifted focus toward observable behaviors and environmental conditioning, with researchers like B.F. Skinner arguing that supernatural beliefs resulted from reinforcement patterns within social learning systems rather than genuine encounters with paranormal phenomena, and behavioral analysis of Black Shuck traditions revealed how cultural transmission mechanisms could maintain folkloric beliefs across generations while adapting to changing environmental conditions, though behaviorist explanations struggled to account for the specific consistency and emotional intensity that characterized the most compelling supernatural encounters. Gestalt psychology's emphasis on perceptual organization and pattern recognition provided insights into how environmental conditions might trigger misinterpretation of normal sensory information, with researchers demonstrating how atmospheric phenomena, lighting conditions, and psychological expectations could combine to generate perceptual experiences that witnesses might reasonably interpret as supernatural encounters, though Gestalt principles also revealed how genuine paranormal phenomena might be dismissed as perceptual errors by observers who lacked appropriate conceptual frameworks for understanding what they were experiencing. The cognitive revolution in psychology during the 1960s introduced information processing models that analyzed supernatural experiences as products of how human minds organize, interpret, and remember sensory information, with researchers identifying cognitive biases and heuristic shortcuts that might predispose individuals to interpret ambiguous stimuli as supernatural phenomena. And these cognitive approaches to Black Shuck encounters revealed sophisticated mental mechanisms through which cultural expectation could influence perception, while also demonstrating how genuine anomalous experiences might be filtered through cognitive processes that altered their apparent characteristics. Social psychology's focus on group dynamics and cultural influence offered explanations for how Black Shuck beliefs might spread through communities via mechanisms like social contagion, conformity pressure, and shared fantasy. with researchers documenting how supernatural experiences could become collective phenomena that involved multiple witnesses whose individual accounts reinforced and elaborated shared cultural narratives. Though social psychological theories had difficulty explaining why certain individuals reported supernatural encounters while others in similar cultural contexts remained unaffected by folkloric traditions. The emergence of environmental psychology during the 1970s examined relationships between physical environments and psychological states, revealing how factors like electromagnetic fields, infrasound, and atmospheric conditions might influence brain function in ways that could trigger experiences resembling supernatural encounters. And while environmental approaches to black shuck sightings offered intriguing possibilities for naturalistic explanations, they also raised questions about whether certain geographical locations might possess characteristics that actually facilitate paranormal phenomena, rather than simply triggering psychological responses that mimic supernatural experiences. Trauma psychology's understanding of how extreme experiences affect memory, perception, and emotional regulation provided new perspectives on supernatural encounters, with researchers recognizing that black shuck sightings often occurred during periods of personal crisis or community stress, and the symptom patterns reported by witnesses, including persistent intrusive memories, heightened startle responses, and avoidance behaviors, resembled post-traumatic stress reactions that typically result from exposure to genuinely threatening experiences rather than simple misperception or cultural suggestion. The development of neuropsychology and brain imaging technologies enabled direct investigation of neural activity during reported supernatural experiences, with researchers like Michael Persinger using electromagnetic stimulation to trigger perceptual phenomena that subjects described using supernatural terminology. And while these laboratory studies suggested that certain types of brain activity might underlie paranormal experiences, they also revealed how little is understood about the relationship between neural mechanisms and conscious experience, particularly for phenomena that involve complex interaction between perception, memory, and cultural interpretation. Developmental psychology's research on how children acquire and maintain beliefs about supernatural phenomena revealed that black shuck traditions involve sophisticated learning processes that integrate sensory experience, cultural transmission, and emotional conditioning in ways that can create compelling subjective realities, regardless of their correspondence to external events, though developmental studies also suggested that children's natural openness to unusual experiences might make them more reliable witnesses to genuinely anomalous phenomena than adults whose perceptual systems have been trained to filter out information that doesn't conform to conventional reality categories. The emergence of positive psychology during recent decades has encouraged investigation of how supernatural experiences might serve beneficial functions in human life, including their potential roles in meaning-making, community bonding, and coping with existential uncertainty. And research on black shuck encounters reveals that even frightening supernatural experiences can contribute to psychological resilience, cultural identity, and spiritual development in ways that purely pathological explanations fail to capture adequately. Evolutionary psychology's attempts to identify adaptive functions for supernatural beliefs suggest that black shuck traditions might represent cultural evolution of psychological mechanisms that originally served survival functions, with spectral hound legends potentially encoding information about environmental dangers, social cooperation, or threat detection that provided selective advantages for communities that maintained such folkloric knowledge, though evolutionary explanations struggle to account for why supernatural beliefs persist in modern environments where their alleged adaptive functions no longer seem relevant. The question of whether psychological explanations for black shuck encounters represent complete accounts of the phenomena, or simply describe human responses to genuinely anomalous experiences continues dividing researchers who must navigate complex relationships between subjective experience, cultural interpretation, and objective reality, and contemporary psychology's growing appreciation for the limitations of reductionist approaches has encouraged more nuanced understanding of supernatural phenomena, that acknowledges both psychological factors and possible external elements that might contribute to such encounters. Cross-cultural psychology's comparative studies of supernatural beliefs reveal that while specific folkloric traditions vary dramatically across different societies, the underlying psychological patterns associated with spectral hound encounters show remarkable consistency that suggests either universal human predispositions or cross-cultural contact with similar phenomena, and these comparative findings raise intriguing questions about whether psychological patterns explanations alone can account for the global distribution of supernatural hound traditions, or whether cultural universals might reflect shared encounters with external realities that transcend psychological categories. The integration of multiple psychological perspectives into comprehensive theoretical frameworks has produced increasingly sophisticated models of supernatural experience that incorporate cognitive, social, developmental, and neurological factors while remaining open to possibilities that purely psychological explanations might not capture all aspects of phenomena like black shuck encounters, and contemporary researchers increasingly recognize that understanding supernatural experiences requires interdisciplinary approaches that combine psychological insight with historical, anthropological, and even physical scientific investigation. The therapeutic applications of psychological research on supernatural experiences have revealed that understanding black shuck encounters and similar phenomena can provide valuable insights for treating individuals who report paranormal experiences, whether those experiences represent psychological phenomena requiring therapeutic intervention or genuine anomalous encounters that require supportive response rather than pathological interpretation, and these clinical applications demonstrate how psychological research can contribute practical benefits regardless of ultimate conclusions about the external reality of supernatural phenomena. You find yourself recognizing that psychological approaches to black shuck encounters, while illuminating important aspects of how human minds process unusual experiences, simultaneously reveal the complexity and mystery that remain embedded within consciousness itself, and perhaps the most important contribution of psychological analysis lies not in explaining away supernatural phenomena, but in demonstrating how much we still don't understand about the relationship between mind and reality, perception and existence, individual experience and cultural meaning, suggesting that psychology's engagement with supernatural phenomena reveals as much about the limits of scientific understanding as it does about the nature of human consciousness and its encounters with whatever mysteries continue to prowl the boundaries between the known and unknown. You descend into the ancient layers of East Anglian soil, where archaeological evidence whispers of prehistoric spiritual traditions that may have given birth to black shuck legends, as modern excavation techniques reveal ritual deposits, sacred sites, and material culture that suggests the spectral hound's origins stretch back far beyond medieval chroniclers to touch the deepest roots of human settlement in Britain. And you might find it fascinating that artifacts buried in darkness thousands of years ago continue shedding light on supernatural traditions that still influence contemporary culture. A systematic archaeological investigation of sites associated with black shuck encounters began during the 1960s, when researchers recognized that folklore traditions often preserved accurate information about historical landscapes, settlements, and cultural practices that official records had forgotten, and early excavations at locations like Bungay and Blithburg revealed evidence of continuous human occupation spanning millennia, with each cultural layer containing artifacts that reflected spiritual beliefs and ritual practices that could have contributed to the development of supernatural folklore. Dr. Francis Pryor's groundbreaking excavations at Flag Fen in Cambridgeshire revealed Bronze Age ritual deposits that included numerous dog remains in contexts that suggest religious rather than domestic significance. And while Flag Fen lies outside the traditional black shuck territory, the discovery demonstrates that prehistoric British communities associated canines with spiritual practices in ways that could have evolved into later folkloric traditions about supernatural hounds, though establishing direct connections between archaeological evidence and medieval legends requires careful analysis that avoids overstating the implications of material remains. The Romano-British period produced archaeological evidence that more directly relates to Black Shuck traditions, as excavations at sites throughout East Anglia have uncovered votive deposits, religious monuments, and burial practices that incorporated canine imagery and actual dog remains in contexts that suggest continuity with earlier prehistoric traditions, while also revealing adaptation to Roman religious practices, creating complex cultural hybrids that preserved indigenous beliefs within new institutional frameworks that could have sustained supernatural folklore through periods of political and social upheaval. The discovery of the Sutton Hoo ship burial in 1939 revealed Anglo-Saxon royal graves that included elaborate metalwork featuring supernatural hounds and wolves, in contexts that suggest these creatures held important spiritual significance for early medieval English rulers. And while Sutton Hoo represents aristocratic rather than folk culture, the presence of supernatural canine imagery in such prestigious contexts indicates that beliefs about spectral hounds had penetrated the highest levels of Anglo-Saxon society, potentially providing official validation for folkloric traditions that might otherwise have been dismissed as peasant superstition. Recent applications of ground-penetrating radar and satellite archaeology to Black Shuck-associated locations have revealed previously unknown archaeological features including prehistoric enclosures, Roman villa complexes, and medieval religious sites that demonstrate continuous sacred use of specific landscapes across multiple historical periods. And these technological advances enable non-invasive investigation of sites where traditional excavation might disturb ongoing religious or cultural activities, while providing new evidence about the historical context within which supernatural traditions developed. The analysis of ancient DNA extracted from dog remains found in archaeological context throughout East Anglia has revealed information about prehistoric and historical canine populations that challenges assumptions about the relationship between domestic animals and wild species in ancient Britain, with some evidence suggesting that unusual canine breeds or hybrid populations might have existed in medieval England, potentially providing naturalistic foundations for supernatural folklore about creatures that appeared larger, more intelligent, or more threatening than normal domestic dogs. The investigation of medieval church sites using archaeological techniques has produced intriguing evidence about the relationship between Christian architecture and pre-existing sacred landscapes, with excavations revealing that many East Anglian churches were built on locations that had been used for religious purposes since prehistoric times, and this continuity of sacred use suggests that Black Shuck legends might preserve folk memories of ancient spiritual practices that survived Christianization by adapting to new religious frameworks while maintaining essential characteristics. The study of place names using linguistic archaeology has revealed that many locations associated with Black Shuck encounters contain toponymic elements that reference supernatural creatures, ancient religious practices, or prehistoric landscape features. And while place name evidence must be interpreted carefully to avoid anachronistic assumptions, the linguistic patterns suggest that supernatural folklore became embedded in the cultural geography of East Anglia at very early historical periods, possibly preserving information about landscapes and spiritual traditions that would otherwise be lost to historical record. The application of environmental archaeology to Black Shuck studies has reconstructed ancient landscapes and ecosystems that provide context for understanding how supernatural traditions might have developed in response to specific environmental conditions, including the presence of wolves, large domestic dogs, or unusual atmospheric phenomena that could have contributed to the development of folkloric traditions about spectral hounds, though distinguishing between environmental factors that inspired supernatural beliefs and those that might have facilitated genuine paranormal phenomena remains methodologically challenging. The discovery of medieval and post-medieval artifacts at Black Shuck encounter sites has provided material evidence that corroborates some aspects of historical accounts, while also revealing details about the social and economic contexts within which supernatural encounters allegedly occurred, including pilgrimage badges, religious artifacts, and personal items that suggest spiritual seekers were attracted to locations where paranormal phenomena had been reported, creating feedback loops between supernatural belief and material culture that reinforced folkloric traditions through physical evidence and commercial activity. The question of whether archaeological evidence supports supernatural explanations for Black Shuck encounters, or simply provides historical context for understanding how folkloric traditions developed remains hotly debated among researchers who must distinguish between material remains that document human beliefs about supernatural phenomena and physical evidence that might support the reality of paranormal activities. And this interpretive challenge reflects broader questions about the relationship between archaeological methodology and phenomena that might exist outside conventional scientific frameworks. The interdisciplinary collaboration between archaeologists and paranormal researchers has produced innovative approaches to investigating supernatural folklore that combine rigorous excavation techniques with open-minded consideration of anomalous evidence. And while such collaborations sometimes create tension between academic standards and speculative interpretation, they also generate new insights about the complex relationships between material culture, spiritual belief, and reported supernatural experiences that neither discipline could achieve independently. The preservation of archaeological sites associated with Black Shuck encounters has become a conservation priority that balances scientific research with respect for ongoing cultural traditions and supernatural beliefs, creating management challenges that require sensitivity to multiple stakeholder interests, including academic researchers, local communities, religious groups, and supernatural enthusiasts who may have different perspectives on the appropriate uses and interpretations of historically significant locations. The development of experimental archaeology has enabled researchers to investigate how ancient technologies, architectural techniques, and environmental conditions might have influenced supernatural experiences, with some studies suggesting that medieval church acoustics, lighting conditions, and architectural features could have created sensory effects that witnesses might reasonably interpret as paranormal phenomena. Though experimental approaches also raise questions about whether attempts to recreate historical conditions can adequately capture the complex cultural and psychological contexts within which supernatural encounters allegedly occurred. The digital documentation of archaeological evidence using advanced photographic, mapping, and modeling techniques has created unprecedented opportunities for analyzing material remains associated with Black Shuck traditions, and online archives enable international collaboration among researchers while also making archaeological evidence accessible to broader audiences who can contribute local knowledge, historical information, and contemporary accounts that enrich scholarly understanding of supernatural folklore and its relationship to material culture. The legal frameworks governing archaeological investigation of supernatural sites must balance competing interests including scientific research, cultural preservation, property rights, and religious freedom, and these regulatory challenges reflect broader social questions about how contemporary societies should approach historical phenomena that exist at the intersection of empirical evidence and spiritual belief, requiring policy decisions that respect both scholarly inquiry and cultural sensitivity, while protecting valuable archaeological resources for future investigation. The funding challenges that affect archaeological research on supernatural topics reveal institutional biases within academic and governmental systems that prioritize certain types of historical investigation while marginalizing studies of folkloric traditions and paranormal phenomena, despite the cultural significance and scholarly value of research that examines how human communities have understood and responded to encounters with unexplained phenomena throughout history. The training of archaeologists to work with supernatural material requires specialized knowledge about folkloric traditions, spiritual practices, and paranormal phenomena that standard academic programs often neglect, creating educational challenges that must be addressed if archaeological investigation of Black Shuck traditions is to achieve its full potential for illuminating the complex relationships between material culture, spiritual belief, and reported supernatural experiences. The international context for archaeological research on spectral hound traditions reveals similar folkloric patterns throughout Europe and beyond, suggesting either cultural diffusion of supernatural beliefs or independent development of comparable traditions in response to similar environmental, psychological, or possibly paranormal factors, and comparative archaeological investigation of supernatural folklore from different cultural contexts provides valuable perspective on the unique characteristics of English Black Shuck traditions, while also illuminating universal aspects of human responses to encounters with mysterious phenomena. You realize that archaeological evidence, while providing valuable historical context and material documentation of human responses to supernatural beliefs, ultimately raises more questions than it answers about the relationship between ancient spiritual traditions and contemporary paranormal experiences. And perhaps the most significant contribution of archaeological research lies not in proving or disproving the reality of supernatural phenomena, but in demonstrating the profound historical continuity of human encounters with mystery, the persistent human need to understand and respond to unexplained experiences, and the remarkable capacity of cultural traditions to preserve information across millennia, while adapting to changing social conditions and technological capabilities, suggesting that whatever the ultimate reality of Black Shuck encounters, they represent something fundamental about human consciousness and its relationship to phenomena that exist at the boundary of known and unknown, natural and supernatural, material evidence and spiritual experience. You journey across the diverse landscapes of East Anglia and beyond, discovering that Black Shuck legends have evolved into a rich tapestry of regional variations that reflect local geography, cultural history, and community experiences, each area developing distinctive characteristics for their spectral hound, while maintaining enough common elements to suggest either shared origins or remarkably consistent encounters with similar phenomena. And you might find it intriguing that supernatural folklore demonstrates the same capacity for both unity and diversity that characterizes biological evolution or linguistic development. The Norfolk version of Black Shuck traditions emphasizes the creature's connection to ancient trackways and Roman roads, with witnesses consistently reporting encounters along specific routes that archaeological evidence confirms were used for transportation and communication since prehistoric times. And Norfolk storytellers describe their Black Shuck as particularly associated with marshlands and coastal areas where the boundary between land and sea creates liminal spaces that seem naturally suited for supernatural manifestations, though whether these geographical preferences reflect actual supernatural behavior or cultural interpretation of landscape symbolism remains unclear. Suffolk's Black Shuck traditions, centered around the famous Bungay and Blithburg encounters, typically describe a creature that appears primarily in association with religious sites and sacred spaces, with local folklore emphasizing the spectral hound's apparent interest in churches, graveyards, and other consecrated locations, and Suffolk accounts often include details about the creature's ability to leave physical traces of its presence, including the alleged claw marks and scorch damage that continue attracting investigators centuries after the original encounters occurred. The Essex variations of Black Shuck legends incorporate elements that reflect the county's proximity to London and its role as a transportation corridor between the capital and East Anglia, with Essex accounts often describing encounters near coaching inns, major roads, and river crossings where travelers from different regions would meet and exchange stories, creating opportunities for folkloric cross-pollination that enriched local traditions while also potentially diluting their distinctive characteristics through cultural mixing and mutual influence. Cambridgeshire's version of the spectral hound tradition adapts to the distinctive landscape of the fens, with local accounts describing a creature that can traverse waterlogged terrain with supernatural ease, appearing and disappearing among the reeds and waterways that characterize this unique English landscape. And Cambridgeshire folklore often emphasizes the Black Shuck's role as a guardian of hidden paths through the marshlands, suggesting that the creature might serve protective functions for those who understood proper protocols for supernatural encounters in challenging terrain. The Lincolnshire padfoot represents a regional variation that shares many characteristics with black shuck, but incorporates distinctive elements that reflect local cultural conditions and geographical features, including accounts that describe the creature as capable of shapeshifting between canine and human forms, a characteristic that appears less frequently in traditional East Anglian accounts and might reflect different cultural influences or possibly distinct supernatural phenomena that became conflated with black shuck traditions through geographical proximity and cultural exchange. Yorkshire's Barghest traditions demonstrate how spectral hound folklore adapts to different cultural and geographical contexts, while maintaining essential characteristics, with Yorkshire accounts typically describing a creature associated with specific families or bloodlines rather than general geographical areas, and the Barghest's reportedly prophetic abilities distinguish it from black shuck's more purely threatening character, suggesting either regional adaptation of shared folkloric material or genuine differences in supernatural phenomena encountered in different parts of England. The Welsh Gwilgi represents another regional variation of supernatural hound traditions that shares characteristics with black shuck, while incorporating distinctively Celtic elements, including associations with ancient stone circles, burial mounds, and other prehistoric monuments that reflect Wales's particular cultural history and spiritual traditions, and comparative analysis of Welsh and English spectral hound legends reveals both striking similarities and significant differences that illuminate how folkloric traditions develop within specific cultural contexts, while possibly preserving memories of shared ancient experiences. The Scottish Combe Sith traditions demonstrate how spectral hound folklore extends throughout the British Isles, while adapting to local conditions, with Scottish accounts typically emphasizing the creature's association with clan territories and family histories, rather than the more generalized geographical connections that characterize English black shuck traditions. And the Cousith's reportedly green coloration contrasts with the consistently black appearance of English spectral hounds, suggesting either cultural adaptation of shared folkloric material or distinct supernatural phenomena that reflect different environmental or spiritual conditions. The question of whether regional variations in spectral hound traditions represent cultural evolution of shared mythological material, or preservation of memories of distinct supernatural encounters continues generating scholarly debate, with some researchers arguing that geographical differences in folkloric details reflect adaptation to local conditions, while others maintain that consistent core characteristics across different regions suggest either remarkable cultural transmission or genuine encounters with phenomena that manifest consistently despite varying cultural contexts. The urban adaptations of black shuck legends that have emerged in areas like Norwich, Ipswich, and other East Anglian cities demonstrate how supernatural folklore evolves to accommodate changing social conditions, with contemporary accounts describing encounters in urban parks, industrial areas, and residential neighborhoods that didn't exist when traditional rural legends first developed, and these urban manifestations raise questions about whether supernatural phenomena adapt to changing landscapes, or whether cultural frameworks for interpreting unusual experiences adapt to new environments while maintaining traditional supernatural imagery. The coastal variations of black shuck legends reflect the distinctive culture and environmental conditions of maritime communities, with fishing villages developing traditions that emphasize the creature's apparent connection to weather patterns, tidal cycles, and maritime activities, and coastal accounts often describe the black shuck as capable of walking on water or appearing during storms, characteristics that distinguish seaside traditions from inland versions while possibly reflecting genuine environmental factors that influence supernatural encounters in coastal regions. The modern transportation network has facilitated the spread and mixing of regional black shuck variations, as improved communication enables residents of different areas to compare their local traditions and potentially influence each other's understanding of supernatural folklore, creating opportunities for cultural hybridization that might either enrich folkloric traditions or dilute their distinctive regional characteristics, depending on whether diversity or consistency is considered more valuable for preserving authentic cultural heritage. The academic study of regional folkloric variations has revealed sophisticated patterns of cultural transmission, adaptation, and innovation that demonstrate how human communities preserve and modify traditional knowledge in response to changing conditions while maintaining enough continuity to preserve essential cultural information across generations. And these patterns of folkloric evolution provide valuable insights into broader processes of cultural change and historical memory that extend far beyond supernatural beliefs to illuminate fundamental aspects of human social development. The documentation challenges associated with regional folkloric variations include the difficulty of distinguishing between authentic local traditions and external influences that might alter or contaminate indigenous cultural material, particularly in areas where tourism, media attentions, or scholarly investigation might introduce foreign elements that become integrated into local traditions and subsequently appear to represent authentic regional characteristics when they actually reflect modern cultural hybridization processes. The preservation efforts aimed at maintaining distinctive regional characteristics of Black Shuck traditions must balance respect for local cultural autonomy with recognition of shared elements that connect different communities through common folkloric heritage, creating conservation challenges that require sensitivity to both unity and diversity within supernatural folkloric traditions, while avoiding either homogenization that erases valuable local distinctions or fragmentation that loses sight of broader cultural patterns. The role of local storytellers, traditional knowledge keepers, and community historians in maintaining regional variations of Black Shuck legends highlights the importance of oral transmission in preserving cultural information that might not appear in written records, and the relationship between formal documentation and informal cultural transmission reveals complex dynamics that influence how folkloric traditions survive, adapt, and evolve within specific geographical and social contexts over extended historical periods. The economic implications of regional folkloric variations include the development of supernatural tourism industries that capitalize on local traditions while potentially altering them through commercial exploitation, creating feedback loops where tourist expectations influence local presentation of folkloric material, which in turn might affect how community members understand and preserve their own cultural heritage, raising questions about the relationship between cultural authenticity and economic development in communities that possess valuable folkloric resources. The legal and regulatory frameworks that affect regional folkloric traditions vary significantly across different governmental jurisdictions, creating complex situations where supernatural folklore might receive different types of official recognition, protection, or documentation depending on local political conditions, administrative priorities, and cultural policies that reflect broader social attitudes toward traditional knowledge and supernatural belief systems. The educational approaches to teaching about regional folkloric variations must navigate competing demands for cultural sensitivity, historical accuracy, academic rigor, and public accessibility, creating pedagogical challenges that require sophisticated understanding of how folkloric traditions function within specific communities, while also contributing to broader cultural knowledge and appreciation for the diversity and complexity of human supernatural beliefs and experiences. The digital preservation of regional Black Shuck variations through online archives, multimedia documentation, and virtual reality reconstructions creates new opportunities for maintaining cultural heritage, while also raising questions about how technological mediation might affect the essential characteristics of folkloric traditions that developed within specific geographical and social context, and the relationship between traditional oral transmission and digital preservation reflects broader questions about cultural continuity and change in contemporary technological societies. You find yourself recognizing that the regional variations of Black Shuck legends represent a remarkable example of how human communities adapt shared cultural material to local conditions while maintaining enough common elements to preserve collective cultural identity, and whether these variations reflect cultural evolution of shared mythological material or distinct encounters with phenomena that manifest differently in different geographical locations They demonstrate the sophisticated ways in which folkloric traditions serve multiple functions within human societies, including cultural identity maintenance, environmental knowledge transmission, social cohesion building, and meaning-making in response to encounters with mystery and uncertainty that continue challenging human understanding, regardless of technological advancement or cultural sophistication. You step into the surprisingly active world of contemporary Black Shuck encounters, where 21st-century witnesses armed with smartphones, GPS devices, and scientific skepticism continue reporting experiences that mirror historical accounts with unsettling accuracy, challenging assumptions that supernatural folklore should naturally decline in educated, technologically advanced societies. And you might find it particularly intriguing that some of the most compelling modern accounts come from individuals whose professional backgrounds would seem to preclude belief in supernatural phenomena. The digital age has transformed how supernatural encounters are reported, documented, and analyzed, with contemporary Black Shuck witnesses using social media platforms, paranormal forums, and specialized websites to share their experiences with global audiences, creating unprecedented opportunities for comparative analysis, while also introducing new challenges related to hoaxes, viral misinformation, and the influence of popular culture on witness expectations. And the speed with which information now travels means that modern sightings can influence subsequent reports in ways that might either contaminate authentic experiences or validate genuine encounters through rapid corroboration. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a veterinarian practicing in rural Norfolk, reported encountering Black Shuck in 2018 while responding to an emergency call near Wymandham, and her detailed account includes observations about the creature's anatomy that reflect her professional expertise in animal behavior and physiology, noting characteristics that seemed inconsistent with any known canine species, including apparent independence from normal respiratory patterns, unusual proportional relationships between different body parts, and behavioral patterns that suggested intelligence beyond normal animal cognition, though she emphasizes that her scientific training makes her reluctant to accept supernatural explanations for experiences that might have naturalistic causes she hasn't yet identified. The proliferation of security cameras, dashboard cameras, and mobile phone recording capabilities has created new possibilities for obtaining photographic evidence of supernatural encounters, and several recent Black Shuck sightings include digital imagery that witnesses claim documents their experiences, though analysis of these images typically reveals the same ambiguities that have characterized supernatural photography since Victorian times, with unclear shapes, lighting artifacts, and technical issues that allow for multiple interpretations depending on the observer's preconceptions about the reality of paranormal phenomena. The 2019 encounter reported by Mark Thompson, a truck driver with 30 years of experience traveling East Anglian roads at night, occurred near the A134 outside Thetford, and included details that suggest remarkable consistency with historical accounts, despite Thompson's initial unfamiliarity with Black Shuck traditions, and his description of the creature's glowing eyes, silent movement, and the overwhelming sense of dread that accompanied its presence matches medieval descriptions so closely that researchers have struggled to explain how cultural transmission could account for such specific parallels in the absence of deliberate research into folkloric traditions. The emergence of organized paranormal investigation groups has brought increasingly sophisticated technological approaches to documenting Black Shuck encounters, with investigators using electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, audio recording equipment, and other devices in attempts to gather empirical evidence of supernatural phenomena. Though the results of these investigations typically generate more controversy than consensus, as believers interpret ambiguous data as validation, while skeptics find naturalistic explanations for the same evidence, revealing the persistent challenges of applying scientific methodology to phenomena that might not conform to conventional physical laws. The psychological profiling of contemporary Black Shuck witnesses reveals demographic diversity that challenges stereotypical assumptions about who reports supernatural experiences, with encounters documented by police officers, teachers, healthcare professionals, engineers, and other individuals whose careers require critical thinking skills and empirical approaches to problem solving, suggesting that modern black shuck sightings transcend simple categories of superstition, cultural conditioning, or psychological pathology that might explain supernatural beliefs in previous historical periods. The environmental monitoring of locations where contemporary black shuck encounters occur has revealed some intriguing correlations with electromagnetic anomalies, atmospheric pressure variations, and geological features that certain researchers argue might contribute to supernatural experiences, while others maintain that apparent correlations between natural phenomena and paranormal reports reflect selective attention rather than genuine causal relationships. And the debate over environmental factors demonstrates how contemporary scientific tools can both illuminate and complicate efforts to understand supernatural experiences. The legal documentation of modern black shuck encounters includes insurance claims, police reports, and medical records that provide official recognition of witnesses' experiences while carefully avoiding institutional endorsement of supernatural explanations, creating interesting case studies in how contemporary bureaucratic systems process claims that exist at the boundaries between empirical evidence and spiritual belief. And these official documents preserve valuable information about supernatural experiences while also revealing how institutional frameworks influence the language and categories used to describe paranormal phenomena. The social media analysis of contemporary black shuck reports reveals complex patterns of cultural transmission, mutual influence, and community formation among individuals who share similar experiences, with online communities providing support networks for witnesses, while also creating opportunities for the exchange of information that might either contaminate authentic experiences or validate genuine encounters through independent corroboration from multiple sources. And the global reach of digital communication enables unprecedented comparative analysis of supernatural folklore across different geographical and cultural contexts. The medical documentation of physical and psychological effects reported by contemporary black shuck witnesses includes clinical case studies that reveal symptom patterns consistent with exposure to genuinely traumatic experiences, including persistent anxiety, sleep disturbances, and specific phobias that seem disproportionate to normal animal encounters, but appropriate for encounters with genuinely threatening phenomena. And modern psychiatric and neurological assessment techniques provide more sophisticated understanding of how supernatural experiences affect human health and well-being than was available to previous generations of researchers. The question of whether contemporary black shuck sightings represent cultural continuity of ancient traditions, psychological manifestations of archetypal fears, or genuine encounters with phenomena that transcend conventional understanding remains hotly debated among researchers who must navigate the complex relationship between historical documentation, contemporary experience, and scientific skepticism, while remaining open to possibilities that established theoretical frameworks might not adequately explain all aspects of reported supernatural encounters. The academic study of modern black shuck encounters has benefited from interdisciplinary collaboration between folklorists, psychologists, sociologists, environmental scientists, and other specialists who bring diverse methodological approaches to investigating supernatural phenomena. And while this interdisciplinary engagement has generated valuable insights, it has also revealed the extent to which different academic disciplines can analyze the same evidence using different theoretical frameworks and reach contradictory conclusions about the nature and significance of reported paranormal experiences. The technological infrastructure that supports contemporary supernatural investigation includes specialized equipment, communication networks, and analytical software that enable more sophisticated documentation and analysis of paranormal claims than ever before. Yet these technological capabilities also introduce new sources of error, misinterpretation, and deliberate deception that complicate efforts to distinguish between authentic supernatural experiences and various forms of fraud, mistake, or technological malfunction, demonstrating that technological advancement doesn't necessarily simplify the challenge of understanding anomalous phenomena. The cultural impact of modern black shuck sightings extends beyond supernatural belief communities, to influence popular entertainment, tourism marketing, and local identity formation in ways that create feedback loops between genuine folklore traditions and commercial exploitation of supernatural themes, and these economic and cultural factors raise questions about how contemporary social conditions might influence both the reporting and interpretation of supernatural experiences in ways that either support or undermine their authenticity and cultural significance. The international context for contemporary Black Shuck research includes comparative studies of similar supernatural traditions from other cultures and geographical regions, revealing patterns that suggest either universal human tendencies toward certain types of paranormal experience or cross-cultural contact with phenomena that manifest consistently across different social and environmental contexts, and these comparative investigations provide valuable perspective on the unique characteristics of English spectral hound traditions, while also illuminating broader questions about human consciousness and its relationship to unexplained phenomena. The ethical considerations surrounding research on contemporary Black Shuck encounters include responsibilities to protect witness privacy, avoid sensationalism, and maintain scientific objectivity, while also respecting cultural traditions and spiritual beliefs that might be affected by academic investigation, and these ethical challenges reflect broader questions about the appropriate relationship between scholarly inquiry and phenomena that exist at the intersection of empirical evidence and personal meaning-making that require sensitivity to multiple stakeholder interests and values. The future directions for research on modern Black Shuck sightings include development of improved methodological frameworks, technological innovations that might enhance documentation capabilities, and theoretical advances that could provide better understanding of the relationship between consciousness, culture, and reported supernatural experiences. And while contemporary research has generated valuable insights into the complexity of paranormal phenomena, it has also revealed how much remains unknown about the fundamental nature of human consciousness and its encounters with mystery that continue challenging established categories of knowledge and belief. You find yourself confronting the reality that contemporary Black Shuck encounters persist in defying easy explanation despite unprecedented technological capabilities and scientific sophistication, suggesting that whatever the ultimate nature of these phenomena, they represent something more complex and enduring than simple cultural survivals or psychological artifacts. And perhaps the most significant insight from modern research lies not in resolving the mystery, but in recognizing how encounters with unexplained phenomena continue playing important roles in human experience, challenging assumptions about the relationship between knowledge and mystery, rational explanation and spiritual meaning, scientific understanding and cultural wisdom that transcend any particular historical period or technological context. You explore the profound ways in which Black Shuck has woven itself into the fabric of English cultural identity, transcending its origins as regional folklore to become a symbol that connects contemporary England with its ancient past, influences artistic expression, and provides a shared reference point for understanding the persistence of mystery within modern rational society. And you might find it remarkable that a spectral hound from medieval East Anglia has achieved cultural significance that extends far beyond supernatural belief to touch literature, tourism, national heritage preservation, and even discussions about what it means to be English in an increasingly globalized world. The literary legacy of Black Shuck extends from medieval chronicles through contemporary fiction, with the spectral hound inspiring countless authors who have found in the legend a perfect metaphor for the persistence of ancient mysteries within modern civilization, and writers ranging from M.R. James to contemporary horror novelists have used Black Shuck imagery to explore themes of cultural memory, the relationship between past and present, and the ongoing human need to understand phenomena that resist rational explanation, creating a literary tradition that keeps the legend alive while also transforming it into something broader than its original folkloric context. The tourism industry that has developed around Black Shuck traditions demonstrates how supernatural folklore can become valuable economic resources for rural communities, with visitor centers, guided tours, and heritage sites capitalizing on the legend's enduring appeal, while also serving educational functions that preserve historical information and cultural traditions that might otherwise be lost to social change and modernization, though the commercialization of supernatural folklore also raises questions about authenticity, cultural appropriation, and the relationship between genuine tradition and manufactured tourist experiences. The incorporation of Black Shuck imagery into official heritage preservation efforts reflects recognition that supernatural folklore represents an important aspect of English cultural history that deserves protection and promotion alongside more conventional historical sites and traditions, with English Heritage and similar organizations acknowledging that understanding England's cultural identity requires appreciation for the supernatural beliefs and folklore traditions that have shaped community life and individual consciousness across centuries of social development and cultural change. The psychological significance of Black Shuck as a cultural symbol extends beyond supernatural belief to provide frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual experience and collective memory, offering ways to process anxiety, fear, and uncertainty that transcend specific supernatural encounters to address broader human concerns about mortality, meaning, and the limits of rational understanding. And the legend's persistence suggests that cultural symbols rooted in mystery and uncertainty serve important psychological functions that rational explanation cannot easily replace. The educational integration of Black Shuck studies into academic curricula at various levels demonstrates growing recognition that supernatural folklore provides valuable opportunities for interdisciplinary learning that combines historical research, literary analysis, psychological insight, and cultural understanding in ways that illuminate complex relationships between knowledge and belief, tradition and innovation, local identity and universal human experience, creating pedagogical approaches that engage student interest while developing critical thinking skills and cultural literacy. The artistic inspiration that Black Shuck has provided for painters, musicians, filmmakers, and other creative professionals reflects the legend's capacity to stimulate imagination and provide rich metaphorical material for exploring themes that extend far beyond supernatural encounters, to include questions about nature versus civilization, tradition versus modernity, and the ongoing human fascination with mystery and the unknown. And artistic treatments of Black Shuck themes contribute to cultural dialogue about values, beliefs, and priorities that shape contemporary society. The role of Black Shuck in regional identity formation demonstrates how supernatural folklore can serve as powerful symbols of local distinctiveness and cultural heritage that help communities maintain unique characteristics while participating in broader national and international cultural networks. And East Anglian pride in the Black Shuck legend reflects broader patterns of how local traditions contribute to sense of place and community identity that transcend economic or political considerations to address fundamental human needs for belonging and cultural meaning. The international recognition of Black Shuck as distinctively English supernatural folklore has contributed to global understanding of British culture and national character, with the legend serving as an example of how England has maintained connections to its ancient past while adapting to modern conditions. And international academic interest in Black Shuck studies reflects broader fascination with how different cultures understand and preserve supernatural traditions that provide insights into universal human experiences of mystery and uncertainty. The media representation of Black Shuck in television programs, documentaries, and popular publications has significantly influenced public understanding of the legend while also shaping how contemporary witnesses interpret their own experiences, creating complex feedback loops between traditional folklore and modern media that both preserve and transform supernatural traditions in ways that reflect changing cultural values and technological capabilities. And media treatment of Black Shuck themes reveals ongoing cultural negotiations about the appropriate relationship between scientific skepticism and respect for traditional beliefs. The academic institutionalization of Black Shuck studies within universities and research organizations demonstrates growing recognition that supernatural folklore deserves serious scholarly attention as a legitimate field of cultural investigation that provides valuable insights into history, psychology, sociology, and other disciplines, and the establishment of formal research programs focused on supernatural folklore reflects broader academic trends toward interdisciplinary approaches and appreciation for traditional knowledge systems that complement, rather than compete with conventional scholarly methodologies. The legal and policy implications of Black Shuck's cultural significance include heritage protection laws, tourism regulations, and intellectual property considerations that reflect contemporary society's attempts to balance preservation of traditional cultural materials with economic development, technological innovation, and changing social values, and these legal frameworks reveal how supernatural folklore intersects with broader questions about cultural ownership, community rights, and the appropriate role of government in preserving and promoting traditional knowledge and belief systems. The religious and spiritual dimensions of Black Shuck's cultural impact extend beyond traditional Christian interpretations to encompass contemporary pagan, neo-shamanic, and alternative spiritual movements that find in the legend resources for understanding human relationships with nature, ancestors, and supernatural forces, and these diverse spiritual appropriations of Black Shuck imagery demonstrate how ancient symbols can acquire new meanings while maintaining connections to their historical origins and cultural contexts. The technological mediation of Black Shuck traditions through digital platforms, virtual reality experiences, and interactive media creates new possibilities for cultural transmission, while also raising questions about how technological intervention might alter the essential characteristics of supernatural folklore that developed within specific geographical and social context, and the relationship between traditional oral transmission and digital preservation reflects broader cultural questions about continuity and change in contemporary information societies. The psychological therapeutic applications of Black Shuck-related cultural work include art therapy, storytelling interventions, and community healing practices that use supernatural folklore as resources for addressing trauma, anxiety, and other mental health challenges, demonstrating how traditional cultural materials can contribute to contemporary wellness approaches that integrate spiritual, psychological, and social dimensions of human experience in ways that complement rather than compete with conventional medical and therapeutic interventions. The environmental conservation connections between Black Shuck traditions and landscape preservation efforts reveal how supernatural folklore can support ecological awareness and environmental protection by providing cultural justifications for maintaining natural areas that might otherwise be threatened by development pressures, and the association between supernatural encounters and specific geographical locations creates stakeholder interests that can contribute to conservation efforts while also preserving the environmental contexts within which folkloric traditions developed and continue to flourish. The generational transmission of Black Shuck traditions within families and communities demonstrates how supernatural folklore continues serving important social functions related to cultural continuity, identity formation, and meaning-making across different age groups, and research on how different generations understand and relate to Black Shuck legends reveals both remarkable continuity in essential cultural transmission and significant adaptation to changing social conditions and technological environments. The feminist interpretations of Black Shuck traditions have explored how supernatural folklore reflects and potentially challenges gender roles, power relationships, and women's experiences within historical and contemporary cultural contexts, revealing both oppressive and liberating dimensions of supernatural beliefs, while also demonstrating how traditional materials can be reinterpreted to serve contemporary social justice and cultural criticism agendas that extend far beyond their original folkloric contexts. The post-colonial analysis of Black Shuck's cultural significance examines how supernatural folklore functions within broader patterns of cultural dominance and resistance, exploring questions about whose traditions receive official recognition and preservation, while also investigating how supernatural beliefs might serve as resources for maintaining cultural autonomy and resistance to homogenizing forces associated with globalization and cultural standardization. The economic anthropology of Black Shuck-related cultural activities reveals complex relationships between traditional knowledge, commercial exploitation, intellectual property, and community ownership that reflect broader questions about how cultural resources should be managed, protected, and shared in ways that respect traditional knowledge holders while also enabling broader cultural participation and economic development based on folkloric heritage and supernatural tourism. You discover that Black Shuck's cultural impact extends far beyond questions about the reality of supernatural encounters to encompass fundamental issues of cultural identity, historical memory, artistic inspiration, and social meaning that demonstrate how supernatural folklore continues serving essential functions within contemporary society. And perhaps the legend's greatest significance lies not in resolving questions about paranormal phenomena, but in providing ongoing opportunities for cultural dialogue about values, beliefs, and priorities that shape how human communities understand their relationships to mystery, tradition, and the persistent possibility that reality contains dimensions that transcend conventional knowledge and rational explanation. You stand at the threshold between the known and unknown, where more than 1,000 years of Black Shuck encounters have created a legacy that transcends simple folklore to become something approaching a cultural institution, a shared reference point for understanding how mystery persists within human experience, regardless of technological advancement or scientific sophistication. And as you reflect on this remarkable journey through centuries of supernatural encounters, scholarly investigation, and cultural transformation, you begin to recognize that the ultimate significance of the Black Shuck legend may lie not in resolving questions about its reality, but in illuminating fundamental aspects of human consciousness and its eternal engagement with phenomena that resist complete explanation. The persistence of Black Shuck encounters across such an extended historical period, surviving religious conversion, scientific revolution, social upheaval, and technological transformation, suggests that whatever psychological, cultural, or supernatural factors contribute to these experiences, they operate at levels of human existence that transcend the surface changes that mark different historical eras. And perhaps the legend's most remarkable characteristic lies in its capacity to remain relevant and compelling to each new generation, while maintaining essential features that connect contemporary witnesses with medieval chroniclers, Victorian ghost hunters, and all the individuals who have found themselves confronting something that challenges conventional understanding of reality. The methodological challenges that have frustrated centuries of investigation, from medieval theological analysis through contemporary scientific inquiry, reveal how phenomena that exist at the boundaries between objective reality and subjective experience resist the analytical frameworks that prove successful for understanding more conventional aspects of human knowledge. And the history of Black Shuck research demonstrates both the remarkable persistence of human curiosity about unexplained phenomena and the limitations of any single approach to understanding experiences that may require integration of multiple ways of knowing, including empirical observation, cultural interpretation, psychological insight, and perhaps openness to possibilities that transcend established academic categories. The cultural functions that Black Shuck traditions have served throughout their long history, including community bonding, identity formation, meaning-making in response to uncertainty, and preservation of historical memory, suggest that supernatural folklore provides essential services for human communities that purely rational or scientific worldviews might struggle to replace, and the legend's evolution demonstrates how traditional knowledge systems adapt to changing conditions while maintaining core functions that address persistent human needs for connection to mystery, tradition, and sources of meaning that extend beyond immediate practical concerns. The geographical distribution of Black Shuck encounters, concentrated in East Anglia but extending throughout Britain and even internationally through cultural transmission and possibly independent manifestation, raises intriguing questions about whether certain landscapes possess characteristics that facilitate supernatural experiences, or whether cultural frameworks for interpreting unusual encounters can transcend geographical boundaries to create shared symbolic languages for understanding phenomena that might occur universally but require appropriate cultural contexts for recognition and interpretation. The demographic diversity of Black Shuck witnesses, spanning all social classes, educational backgrounds, and professional categories, challenges simplistic explanations that attribute supernatural experiences to ignorance, superstition, or psychological pathology, suggesting instead that encounters with unexplained phenomena represent something more fundamental about human consciousness and its capacity for experiencing realities that exist outside conventional perceptual and conceptual frameworks. And this diversity of witness testimony across centuries indicates that whatever generates Black Shuck encounters operates independently of the cultural factors that might be expected to influence supernatural beliefs and experiences. The technological evolution of Black Shuck documentation, from medieval chronicles through Victorian photography to contemporary digital media, demonstrates how each generation has attempted to apply its most sophisticated analytical tools to understanding supernatural phenomena, yet the essential mystery remains intact despite unprecedented capabilities for observation, measurement, and analysis, suggesting either that the phenomena themselves transcend technological investigation or that human consciousness contains dimensions that cannot be fully captured through empirical methodology, regardless of its sophistication. The academic institutionalization of Black Shuck studies within universities and research organizations reflects growing recognition that supernatural folklore deserves serious scholarly attention, while also revealing the challenges that academic frameworks face when attempting to analyze phenomena that may not conform to conventional research methodologies. And the interdisciplinary nature of contemporary supernatural research demonstrates both the complexity of paranormal phenomena and the need for analytical approaches that integrate multiple ways of knowing, rather than privileging any single methodological framework. The commercial and cultural industries that have developed around Black Shuck traditions, including tourism, entertainment, and educational activities, demonstrate how supernatural folklore can generate significant economic and social value, while also raising questions about authenticity, cultural appropriation, and the relationship between genuine spiritual or psychological significance and commercial exploitation. And these economic dimensions of supernatural folklore reveal how ancient traditions continue serving practical functions within contemporary market economies while maintaining their capacity to address deeper human needs for mystery and meaning. The therapeutic and psychological applications of Black Shuck-related cultural work, including art therapy, storytelling interventions, and community healing practices, suggest that supernatural folklore provides valuable resources for addressing mental health challenges, trauma recovery, and personal growth that complement rather than compete with conventional therapeutic approaches. And these applications demonstrate how traditional knowledge systems can contribute to contemporary wellness practices while maintaining their connections to historical cultural contexts and spiritual dimensions of human experience. The international comparative research on spectral hound traditions reveals patterns that suggest either universal human tendencies toward certain types of supernatural experience or cross-cultural contact with phenomena that manifest consistently across different geographical and cultural contexts, and these comparative studies provide valuable perspective on the unique characteristics of English Black Shuck traditions while also illuminating broader questions about human consciousness and its relationship to unexplained phenomena that transcend specific cultural boundaries. The environmental and ecological connections between Black Shuck traditions and landscape preservation efforts reveal how supernatural folklore can support contemporary conservation goals by providing cultural justifications for protecting natural areas that serve as settings for folkloric traditions, and these connections demonstrate how ancient beliefs can contribute to modern environmental awareness while also preserving the geographical contexts within which supernatural encounters allegedly occur. The legal and policy frameworks that affect Black Shuck-related cultural activities reflect contemporary society's attempts to balance preservation of traditional knowledge with economic development, technological innovation, and changing social values, and these regulatory approaches reveal how supernatural folklore intersects with broader questions about cultural ownership, community rights, and the appropriate role of institutions in preserving and promoting beliefs and practices that exist outside conventional knowledge systems. As you contemplate the full scope of the Black Shuck phenomenon, stretching across centuries of human experience and touching countless lives through direct encounters, cultural transmission, artistic inspiration, and scholarly investigation, you begin to appreciate that the legend's ultimate significance may lie not in answering questions about supernatural reality, but in preserving space within human culture for mystery, wonder, and recognition that consciousness and reality contain dimensions that transcend complete rational explanation, and perhaps every generation's encounter with Black Shuck traditions serves as a reminder that despite remarkable advances in knowledge and technology, human existence continues to unfold within larger contexts of mystery that invite ongoing exploration, respect, and humility. The future of Black Shuck research and cultural preservation will likely involve continued integration of technological innovation with traditional knowledge systems, creating new possibilities for documentation and analysis while maintaining respect for the cultural contexts within which supernatural folklore develops and serves essential human functions, and the challenge for future researchers and cultural practitioners will be finding ways to honor both scientific rigor and spiritual significance, empirical investigation and traditional wisdom, skeptical inquiry, and respectful acknowledgement of experiences that transcend conventional explanation. The enduring appeal of Black Shuck legends suggests that regardless of how much human knowledge advances or how sophisticated analytical tools become, there will always remain aspects of existence that invite wonder, curiosity, and humble recognition that reality contains dimensions that exceed human understanding. And perhaps the greatest gift that supernatural folklore provides lies not in confirming or denying particular beliefs about paranormal phenomena, but in maintaining cultural space for mystery, imagination, and openness to possibilities that transcend the boundaries of established knowledge and conventional wisdom. And so, as the mists of East Anglia continue to roll across ancient landscapes where countless generations have walked, wondered, and sometimes encountered something that defies easy explanation, the legend of Black Shuck endures as a testament to the remarkable capacity of human consciousness to engage with mystery, preserve traditional knowledge, and find meaning in experiences that exist at the boundaries between the known and unknown, the natural and supernatural, the explainable and the eternally mysterious, reminding us that no matter how much we learn about the world and ourselves, there will always remain phenomena that invite us to approach the great questions of existence with humility, wonder, and respect for the profound mysteries that surround and sustain human life. The gentle rhythm of your breathing slows as you reflect on this ancient mystery that has accompanied human communities through centuries of change. And perhaps there's something deeply comforting about knowing that despite all our technological achievements and scientific understanding, the world still holds secrets that connect us to our ancestors who gathered around fires to share stories about the strange and wonderful things they encountered in the darkness beyond their settlements. And maybe the Black Shuck represents something essential about the human condition that we would be poorer for losing entirely to the bright lights of complete rational explanation. Your eyelids grow heavy as you consider how this legendary creature has served as a bridge between past and present, connecting medieval monks with contemporary witnesses, ancient fears with modern curiosities, traditional wisdom with scholarly investigation, creating an unbroken chain of cultural memory that transcends individual lives to become something approaching immortality. And in that thought, there's a strange comfort, knowing that some mysteries endure beyond any single human lifespan, to become part of the larger story that connects all human experience across time and space. As sleep approaches, you might find yourself grateful for the existence of legends like Black Shuck, which preserve space in human culture for wonder, mystery, and recognition that, despite all our knowledge and sophistication, we remain part of something larger and more mysterious than we can fully comprehend, something that continues to unfold around us in ways both terrible and beautiful, familiar and strange, inviting us to maintain humility, curiosity, and openness to the eternal possibilities that surround human existence, like the mist that surrounds the ancient churches and marshlands, where England's legendary spectral hound continues its eternal patrol through the realms of mystery and memory. End of script. Sweet dreams.